How's everyone doing today? Oh, I always have the Kit Creator dashboard open just to like monitor stuff in the background, but it by default plays a stream preview. I wonder if there's a way to get rid of that. Well, we'll deal with that later. That's why we have that echo sometimes. But hello, 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 hello. We are back from the weekend. Have my tea as usual. This time some iced tea. Made some for a friend's birthday. Oh, it was quite good. Uh, yeah. Uh, if you remember, we ended last week having a conversation with Calvin Abbasi from one of the largest organizing networks in California, Pico, California, and it was a great conversation. I thought it went really, really well. It was phenomenal to have on. Calvin, if you're watching, thanks so much again. You were a great guest. Much appreciated your presence here. Very, very interesting. He said he enjoyed it himself, so that's cool. He said he wants to come back, so we'll have him on again in the future to be sure. There's a lot of stuff. I'm sure we didn't even scratch the surface with the stuff that organization works on, but I want to encourage everyone again to take a look at their their take action page. I had it here. Let me bring it up on my on our screen so we can take a look at it. But yeah, picocalifornia.org/take action. It is really easy to get signed up and helping out with these really, really awesome causes. They work on all sorts of things. We talked about renters protections mostly with Calvin, but they do a lot of good work. You can take a look at the stuff that they work on, you know, who they are, all this other things. And it can be really, really easy. I understand. I know. I mean, we talked about this last time. I know it seems overwhelming of like, oh, I got to go do this and that, and I got to organize and canvas. And well, no, not necessarily. It could be as simple as like, well, we're trying to get a bunch of people to call their representatives. You just need to leave a 3 minute voicemail, or you just need to, and they'll let you know. They'll fill it in. You don't even have to figure out what you want to do. They might just be like, oh, hey, there's like an event going on here. If you want to come, you can come. Things like that. So I want to encourage everyone to go this direction, as I did before. I don't think I'll harp on about this that much going forward. Just every instance that we talk to someone from the organization. But since we just talked about it, I do want to remind everyone you can take part in the political process. You can have some control over the mechanisms of power in, at the very least, this state, if not the country and the world. You are not helpless. You are not without recourse. And it's difficult and it's hard work and we need collective action. But one of the benefits of collective action is that lots of little actions add up. So even if you do very, very little, that's still doing something and it's appreciated. But that is a bit of, well, it's a little off topic for what we're talking about today. As I mentioned last week, I want to go over the Trump indictments in relation to the January 6th events. And we will be reading over that indictment. However, there's a, well, there's more, I suppose, from someone we've talked about in the past and someone who will continue to come up given that he is a presidential candidate. Excuse me, can't speak today. RFK Jr., who, well, tweeted some Nazi shit. I guess I shouldn't start there. Some people are going to definitely question whether this is in fact Nazi shit, but we'll get to that. RFK Jr.'s latest tweet is being widely interpreted as a Nazi dog whistle. A tweet from the account of Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on Friday used language that many observers say evokes the Nazi hate symbol 1488. I don't think you're gonna want to say that in just a minute, Camgal. Um, so in case you're not familiar, 1488. Yeah, I know it sounds like some interminable online stuff. It is a Nazi number. The reason why 14 refers to the 14 words. It's like a, I don't know. It's like a pledge for white supremacists. It has it even includes like protecting white children as part of the thing. It's like a pledge ish. 88 8 is the H is the fifth, or excuse me, the eighth letter of the English language. 88HH Heil Hitler. That's the transformation there. So yes, 1488 unquestionably is some Nazi stuff. The question is, did RFK Jr. in fact dog whistle this? Let's read on. A post on the candidate's official Twitter account used the numbers 14 and 88 in close proximity. I know this sounds very much like very weird, but we'll get to it. Kennedy has not responded to HuffPost's request for comment or explained the post elsewhere as of Friday afternoon. It's not clear whether he personally approved the tweet. His post on Twitter, which recently rebranded as X, was trying to shame President Joe Biden into providing Secret Service protection for him. It said presidential candidates have been provided Secret Service protection since the assassination of my father in 1968. He added, but not me. Typical turnaround time for pro forma protection requests from presidential candidates is 14 days. After 88 days of no response and after several follow-ups by our campaign, the Biden administration just denied our request. So, is this maybe just happenstance is the question. Well, if we see here the added context, the Secret Service does not provide protection to non-incumbent presidential candidates until 120 days before the election. That would be July 8th, 2024, not this year. This leads me to believe that this is not real. He did not, in fact, do this, or that these numbers are made up. There are reasons I have for that, and we'll get into those after we read a little bit more. 1488 is known as a white supremacist symbol according to the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center. Oh, okay, they get to it. The 14, the symbol, is shorthand for the 14 words slogan that is popular with racists around the world, while 88 stands for Heil Hitler, since H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. The Secret Service website states it's authorized to protect major presidential and vice presidential candidates and their spouses within 120 days of a general presidential election. The election is still more than a year away, which suggests Kennedy wouldn't necessarily receive protection at this point. I also think he wouldn't have asked for it. Does that make sense? Why would you be asking for that protection now when this is something like apparently very easy to find? A random journalist found this. And if he didn't ask for it, why is he saying he did? And why is he saying that with these specific days? And why would he even tell you the days? Why wouldn't you say like after 3 months, right? 88 days, about 90 days, about 3 months. Why would you say 88 days? God, I hate that it does that. All right. This is part of why I think this isn't real and why I do think it's a dog whistle. But we'll get to more in just a moment. HuffPost has reached out to the Secret Service for comment. Kennedy has come under fire for trafficking in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. At a recent dinner, he falsely said the virus that caused the COVID-19 may have been engineered, that it's less harmful to Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese, also false, and that it's targeted to attack Caucasians and black people, false again. He also suggested that Holocaust victims had it easier than COVID sufferers. This is the other reason why I think he's dog whistling. It seems pretty clear that he holds some anti-Semitic views. You can try to cover up for it as much as you like. I'm sorry, it's just on the table. Why is he saying that? Why is he alleging a conspiracy between Jews and Chinese people for this COVID vaccine? Remember, he's a for the COVID virus. He's a vaccine denialist, which means he's a conspiracist already, and thinks that the disease itself was manufactured. Seems like the implications are pretty clear, and we've gone over these before. This seems to be a dog whistle, and the last reason why we'll get to a little bit. Social media users were quick to notice he had loaded language in the Friday tweet. I've read this article already, so I know these are just tweets, and I don't really care. What I do care about is this other article. Robert F. Kennedy tweets, "Mobilize neo-Nazis." Neo-Nazis and white supremacists on Twitter and 4chan expressed delight in finding a new potential ally. Neo-Nazis and white supremacists online have flocked to the support of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. after he included a perceived Nazi dog whistle in a tweet posted last Friday. This post included the numbers 14 and 88 close to one another, resembling the numerical signifier 1488, which represents the 14 words, and 88, which is numerical code for HH or Heil Hitler. That's the last reason. because the message was heard. Because neo-Nazis understand that their views have to be dog whistled because they're generally considered odious. And so they heard the message. And it's pretty telling that just like with Trump, who would signal to white supremacists and refuse to dissociate, that the that RFK's campaign has declined to comment about this tweet, where the appearance to all is that he's signaling to white supremacists and neo-Nazis. It seems pretty clear to me that this was an intentional dog whistle, and I think the reasoning for that I've led you through pretty well, but we can read the rest of this article. Kennedy's perceived call to white supremacists spurred a series of racist and violent speech from users on Twitter, now called X, and 4chan. If you're not familiar, 4chan is a message board that is suffused with Nazism, in part because of its anonymity and low moderation. Any platform that tolerates Nazis will be overrun with them because everyone else will have left. In some cases, it was taken as a call to action for neo-Nazi mobilization, while others were elated at the prospect of another white supremacist ally in government. As one example, Dago Supremacy, an account with over 30,000 followers, tweeted a screenshot of Kennedy's statement with the caption, 14 days for request, 88 days no response, message received, salute emoji. Dago's tweet at the time of publication has amassed over 300,000 views, 400 retweets, and 4,700 likes. So again, the message was heard, and has he since denounced this reading? Is the tweet still up? Let's find out. Is the tweet still up? Where is it? Tweet's still there. The tweet's still there. If he was opposed to the dog whistle, if that wasn't intentional, if this was coincidence, why is this tweet still up? Could just delete it. Just be like, my bad, didn't mean to signal that. That just happens to be the case for the days, but it probably wasn't. This is probably made up. It's probably not true that any of this happened. We were reading. Neo-Nazi reactions to Dago's affirmation of the dog whistle included: message received, Israel will fall, HH brother, 1488 brother, and yeah, there we go. Well, along with, we must secure, secure the safety. These are the 14 words, but it's I think it's like the safety of the future. This is almost exactly the same. I've referenced the 14 words, and what's more based, DeSantis, Black Sun, or Kennedy 1488. In case you're not familiar, DeSantis. I believe it was a fan of DeSantis created an ad for him that his campaign retweeted. It included Black Sun imagery, if I remember correctly. Referencing a video posted by, there we go, a Ron DeSantis staff member featuring the Black Sun, a Nazi symbol made popular by Heinrich Himmler. If you don't believe, if you're like, if we're just seeing things, the Black Sun sigil was literally on the floor of, I don't know how to pronounce it, like Wolfsburg Castle, something like that, during the Nazi regime. That was another very, very common Nazi symbol. Similarly, a now deleted account posted a Photoshop picture of Kennedy with the Black Sun in the background. White supremacist Twitter and 4chan users began declaring Kennedy as /our guy, which is slang originating from 4chan, meaning that he aligns with their extremist views. A thread on 4chan titled RFK Jr. goes 1488, for example, had responses that included quotes from Adolf Hitler and support for RFK Jr. becoming our guy. Not every 4chan user was on board, with some expressing that Kennedy's support for Israel makes him the most pro-Zionist candidate in U.S. history, well, obviously not true, and therefore not one of their own. Support for Kennedy by white supremacists heavily outweighed any dissent, culminating in users showing their support for mobilization and in some cases advocating for violence. And we have another example of the tweet. Like this sentiment that we see in this image is kind of what I'm talking about. That, he'll mention these horrible people who are doing terrible things and hint at conspiracy and people at the top and yada yada, etc. Oh, in 1488, by the way, and the message was heard. They understood what he was saying. Kennedy's newfound white supremacist supporters made it clear that they would mobilize if need be due to his perceived neo-Nazi sympathies. Oh, and by the way, in case this is like this does remind me, in case this seems like, oh, this isn't really real, remember we're about to read an indictment towards Donald Trump regarding his stoking fervor in groups like the Proud Boys, a self-described white chauvinist organization that are full of Nazis and stormed the Capitol. And that were told by Trump to stand down and stand by, as opposed to disperse. This is why this kind of thing matters. A common response on Twitter echoed the same rhetoric used by Donald Trump during a presidential debate, where he referenced the violent white supremacist group, the Proud Boys, saying "Stand back and stand back." I swear, I didn't read this. I stopped to for the related thought, and it's immediately. This has happened like 6 times today. Oh my. East Coast elitist tweeted, "Standing by with 1488 unvaxxed super soldiers, salute." While others like Padolf Liftler, oh my god, said, "Standing down but standing by, sick mind leader." Consistent with references to Trump's message to the Proud Boys, some users like Liquid H posted explicit calls to violence on that show a man with a gun saying, "I'll handle them, Mr. President," next to Kennedy saying these are... Oh, the above image. I don't like how this website handles scrolling. This isn't the first time Kennedy has made comments that appeal to white supremacists. Recently, he spread a conspiracy theory that the COVID-19 pandemic was meant to attack Caucasians and black people, while Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese were more immune to it. These allegations were endorsed by numerous neo-Nazis on their social media accounts, like Thomas Sowell, the Western Chauvinist Telegram channel, and the neo-Nazi internet forum Friends Chan. With Twitter refusing to act against racist, homophobic, and neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic, and conspiratorial content, it has once again demonstrated how its uninformed, profit-first policy is instrumental in creating neo-Nazi echo chambers, aiding in the radicalization process, and increasing the threat of violence through the platforming of extremist rhetoric. By the way, this isn't a refusal. Musk goes out of his way to unban Nazis, to signal boost them, to promote them, because he knows they're his biggest supporters, and he's an egomaniac who's desperate for approval right now for how much he's sending Twitter down the drain and everything else that he touches. So this isn't an accident. It's rather intentional, but this is the kind of thing we get. So Camgal in chat, who is prior a fan of Kennedy for 2024, I hope it's clear why that position is not one that I will stand by on this channel. He seems pretty anti-Semitic. And I don't like bigotry. It's a thing I don't care for. Maybe reconsider that view. But now on to the indictment of Donald Trump. Let's take a moment to catch our breath between these. Little tea as a palate cleanser. I know tea is actually not good as a palate cleanser when it comes to actually to food, right? Because it has that taste or whatever. But in this case, it'll give us a moment to cool down, to relax a bit, take our mind off of fascism and anti-Semitism and Nazism, to instead talk about January 6th. uh, the world's on fire, folks, but we can beat back the fire. We can oppose fascism. It's possible and indeed necessary. The indictment. The grand jury charges that, at all times material to this indictment or on about the dates and the supposed approximate time stated below, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, was the 45th president of the United States and a candidate for re-election in 2020. The defendant lost the 2020 presidential election. Despite having lost, the defendant was determined to remain in power. So for more than 2 months following Election Day on November 3rd, 2020, the defendant spread lies that there had been outcome determinative fraud in the election and that he had actually won. These claims were false, and the defendant knew they were false, but the defendant repeatedly and widely disseminated them anyway. To make his knowingly false claims appear legitimate, create an intense national atmosphere of mistrust and anger, and erode public faith in the administration of the election. The defendant had a right, like every American, to speak publicly about the election and even to claim, falsely, that there had been outcome determinative fraud during the election and that he had won. He was also entitled to formally challenge the results of the election through lawful and appropriate means, such as by seeking recounts or audits of the popular vote in states or filing lawsuits challenging ballots and procedures. Indeed, in many cases, the defendant did pursue these methods of contesting the election results. His efforts to change the outcome in any state through recounts, audits, or legal challenges were uniformly unsuccessful. Something to note about this is a consideration I've had for a little bit. I tend to be in agreement with the concept, if not the practicality, of it is a little bit bothersome that people with this amount of power over public sway, who can rile people in the way that politicians can, and uh, big media figures, celebrities, things like that, can just spread lies openly. I guess not unrelated to the previous person we were talking about, given that we've covered his vaccine lies. And that's just legal. That is just okay for them to mislead the public so thoroughly. I I don't know what a good solution to that problem is, but it's worth noting that there is no that that the way speech works does not give preference to true statements as opposed to false ones, and a society that doesn't doesn't create that preference for true statements, well, it has a lot of problems, as we see over and over and over again. There's a quote from a video game actually, but it's a really good one. It's the I'm paraphrasing, but the power for lies to do harm is far greater than the power for the truth to do good in the world. Shortly after Election Day, the defendant also pursued unlawful means of discounting legitimate votes and subverting the election results. In so doing, the defendant perpetrated 3 criminal conspiracies. Sadly, insurrection is not one of them, even though it's a law in the books, but we take what we can get. A conspiracy to defraud the United States by using dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to impair, obstruct, and defeat the lawful federal government function by which the results of the presidential election are collected, counted, and certified by the federal government in violation of 18 U.S.C. 371. A conspiracy to corruptly obstruct and impede the January 6th congressional proceeding at which the collected results of the presidential election are counted and certified, the certification proceeding, in violation of, there's the statute, and a conspiracy against the right to vote and to have one's vote counted in violation of the statute. Each of these conspiracies, which built on the widespread mistrust of the defendant, the defendant was created through pervasive and destabilizing lies about election fraud, targeted a bedrock function of the United States federal government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election, the federal government function. Count 1. Conspiracy to defraud the United States. The allegations contained in paragraphs 1 through 4 of this indictment are realleged and fully incorporated here by reference. The conspiracy, from on or about November 14th, 2020 through on or about January 20th, 2021, in the District of Columbia and elsewhere, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, did knowingly combine, conspire, confederate, and agree with co-conspirators known and unknown to the grand jury to defraud the United States by using dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to impair, obstruct, and defeat the lawful federal government function by which the results of the presidential election are collected, counted, and certified by the federal government. The purpose of the conspiracy. The purpose of the conspiracy was to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 presidential election by using knowingly false claims of election fraud to obstruct the federal government function by which those results are collected, counted, and certified. So remember, the claim isn't just that he lied. As the indictment has already made clear, lying to the public is legal. It is protected by your freedom of speech. It is not, however, legal to conspire to overturn the results of a lawful election, which is what he did. Or he is accused of doing. But we'll see how much evidence there is toward that end. I know this is annotated, but I'm just like skipping. So like some of it's kind of neat. Like conviction would be punishable by 5 years in prison. Sure, we'll see. Even if he's convicted, I'm not sure that he'll see any time in prison. I'm gonna ignore most of the annotations. I'd rather just read the indictment myself. Seems more authentic that way. The defendant enlisted co-conspirators to assist him in his criminal efforts to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 presidential election and retain power. Among these were A. Co-conspirator 1, an attorney who was willing to spread knowingly false claims and pursue strategies that the defendant's 2020 re-election campaign attorneys would not. So, as far as I understand, these co-conspirators have been identified as, we've figured out. I shouldn't say we, but it has been figured out who these co-conspirators are. I don't really care enough to go find out who they are, but Giuliani's one of them, and other people in this campaign are. But they're talking about people in this campaign. They are unnamed here because they are unindicted co-conspirators. They are not being indicted in this indictment. They might be charged another time. It's hard to know. But for the purposes here, it's not. They're just conspirators. Co-conspirator 2, an attorney who devised and attempted to implement a strategy to leverage the vice president's ceremonial role overseeing the certification proceeding to obstruct the certification of the presidential election. Co-conspirator 3, an attorney whose unfounded claims of election fraud the defendant privately acknowledged to others sounded crazy. Nonetheless, the defendant embraced and publicly amplified co-conspirator 3's disinformation. Co-conspirators 4, a Justice Department official who worked on civil matters and who, with the defendant, attempted to use the Justice Department to open sham election crime investigations and influence state legislatures with knowingly false claims of election fraud. Co-conspirator 5, an attorney who assisted in devising and attempting to implement a plan to submit fraudulent slates of presidential electors to obstruct the certification proceeding. Co-conspirator 6, a political consultant who helped implement a plan to submit fraudulent slates of presidential electors to obstruct the certification proceeding. The federal government function. A federal government function by which the results of the election for President of the United States are collected, counted, and certified was established through the Constitution and the Electoral Act, ECA, federal law. Okay, this is... Alright, we'll still read it, but this is just some background here. Electoral Count Act, ECA, a federal law enacted in 1887. The Constitution provided that individuals called electors shall select the president and that each state determine for itself how to appoint the electors apportioned to it. Through state laws, each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia choose to select their electors based on the popular vote in the state. After Election Day, the ECA required each state to formally determine or ascertain the electors who would represent the state's voters by casting electoral votes on behalf of the candidate who had won the popular vote, and required the executive of each state to certify to the federal government that the identities of those electors. Then, on a date set by the ECA, each state's ascertained electors were required to meet and collect results of the presidential election. That is, to cast electoral votes based on the state's popular vote and send their electoral votes along with the state's executive certification that they were the state's legitimate electors to the United States Congress to be counted and certified in an official proceeding. If you remember, we talked about this a little bit, how the Electoral College isn't just that states have certain number of electoral votes. It's they send people who are allowed to vote in this particular place. This is what this is laying out, the details of that proceeding. Or at the very least, more detailed version of that proceeding. There's obviously a lot more to it than just these couple of sentences. Finally, the Constitution and ECA require that on the 6th of January following Election Day, the Congress meet in a joint session for a certification proceeding, presided over by the Vice President as President of the Senate, to count the electoral votes, resolve any objections, and announce the result, thus certifying the winner of the presidential election as President-elect. Notice that the job of the Vice President is not to actually certify anything, but to announce what Congress has decided. They are merely authorized to be a mouthpiece, not to make any legal take any legal action. This is what Pence was being impugned for not doing, which he can't do, which is to overturn or to refuse to certify the election. He's not allowed to do that. That's not what this role is. This federal government function, from the point of ascertainment to the certification, is foundational to the United States democratic process. It doesn't have to be. And until 2021, had operated in peaceful and orderly manner for over 130 years. The defendant's conspiracy to impair, obstruct, manner and means now. The defendant's conspiracy to impair, obstruct, and defeat the federal government function through dishonesty, fraud, and deceit included the following manner and means. The defendant and co-conspirators used knowingly false claims of election fraud to get state legislators and election officials to subvert the legitimate election results and change the electoral votes for the defendant's opponent, Joseph R. Biden Jr., to electoral votes for the defendant. That is, on the pretext of baseless fraud claims, the defendant pushed officials in certain states to ignore the popular vote, disenfranchise millions of voters, dismiss legitimate electors, and ultimately cause the ascertainment of and voting by illegitimate electors in favor of the defendant. Now, this I didn't know about until these indictments started coming in. But yeah, that's pretty bad. Now, it's bad enough that the United States already disenfranchises a huge number of people through a lot of really stupid means, things like felony disenfranchisement or voter ID bills, or any number of means, or just like gerrymandering to delegitimize their vote. Even the Electoral College is in a way a form of disenfranchisement. But this is more direct than the country is happy with, and obviously this cannot stand. Though the other things shouldn't either, to be clear. The defendant and co-conspirators organized fraudulent slates of electors in 7 targeted states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, attempting to mimic the procedures that the legitimate electors were supposed to follow under the Constitution and other federal and state laws. This included causing the fraudulent electors to meet on the day appointed by federal law on which legitimate electors were to gather and cast their votes, cast fraudulent votes for the defendant, and sign certificates falsely representing that they were legitimate electors. Some fraudulent electors were tricked into participating based on the understanding that their votes would be used only if the defendant succeeded in outcome-determinative lawsuits within their state, which the defendant never did. The defendant and co-conspirators then caused these fraudulent electors to transmit their false certificates to the vice president and other government officials to be counted at the certification proceeding on January 6th. The defendant and co-conspirators attempted to use the power and authority of the Justice Department to conduct sham election crime investigations and to send a letter to the targeted states that falsely claimed that the Justice Department had identified significant concerns that may have impacted the election outcome, that sought to advance the defendant's fraudulent elector plan by using the Justice Department's authority to falsely present the fraudulent electors as a valid alternative to the legitimate electors, and that urged, on behalf of the Justice Department, the targeted states' legislators to convene to create the opportunity to choose the fraudulent electors over the legitimate electors. So actively trying to overturn the election, this should be unambiguous. If he did this, which I'm sure the evidence is forthcoming in this 45-page indictment, this is, without question, an attempt to overturn the election. Even if there were outcome determinative fraud, and there was not, even if this is not how you do anything about that. This is not challenging outcome determinative fraud. This is overturning an election because you think that there's been fraud. There are legal means of challenging fraud, legal means that they also used and were rebuffed because there was no fraud. This is not that. The defendant and co-conspirators attempted to enlist the vice president to use his ceremonial role at the January 6th certification proceeding to fraudulently alter the election results. First, using knowingly false claims of election fraud, the defendant and co-conspirators attempted to convince the vice president to use the defendant's fraudulent electors, reject legitimate electoral votes, or send legitimate electoral votes to state legislatures for review rather than counting them. When that failed, on the morning of January 6th, the defendant and co-conspirators repeated knowingly false claims of election fraud to gather supporters, falsely told them that the vice president had the authority to and might alter the election results, and directed them to the Capitol to obstruct the certification proceedings and exert pressure on the vice president to take fraudulent actions he had previously refused. As a note about this, something that's been coming up over and over that I haven't yet mentioned is that the Trump campaign and the Trump administration knew that there was no outcome determinative fraud. He is on record as understanding and knowing that there was not election fraud, and he was screaming it and getting his supporters to believe it anyway. After it became public on the afternoon of January 6th that the vice president would not fraudulently alter the election results, a large and angry crowd, including many individuals whom the defendant had deceived into believing the vice president could and might change the election results, violently attacked the Capitol and halted the proceeding. As violence ensued, the defendant and co-conspirators exploited the disruption by redoubling efforts to levy false claims of election fraud and convinced members of Congress to further delay the certification based on those claims. Now that we've gone over the means, something I want to remind everyone of is how close things actually were. So obviously Pence didn't have any legal right to deny the certification. But let's say he did. Let's say he tried anyway. What's the solution for that? I don't think there's a rule about that, because why would you have a rule about that? Who would ever think that that's going to happen? What's more, what if the majority of Congress was just on board? Was just on board with like, yeah, let's just overturn the election. What do you do about it? Law is only really effective if it's enforced. And if all the people in positions of power refuse to enforce it or use their power instead to subvert the law, what do you do? Now, we are lucky that this effort was unsuccessful, but this is the importance of anti-fascist action at every level. Because while electoralism is insufficient, hey, not having fascists in office is pretty good, actually. That there weren't enough fascists on board that day worked out pretty nicely. I'm glad there weren't more of them. And any means of fighting fascism, I think, on a political level, I think are good. You know, we should oppose fascism. It's good, including electoralism. I know a lot of people, or some number of people on the left, are like, giving up on electoralism. Well, it's one tool in the arsenal, and diversity of tactics is good. Another way is, you know, things like the efforts of leftist organizing. You know, political protests and whatever. Those are you know, direct action, as it were. Those are also good. We can do multiple things. And anything to keep fascists out of office. The defendant's knowledge of the falsity of his election fraud claims. Here we go. The defendant, his co-conspirators, and their agents made knowingly false claims that there had been outcome determinative fraud in the 2020 presidential election. These prolific lies about election fraud included dozens of specific claims that there had been substantial fraud in certain states, such as that large numbers of dead, non-resident, non-citizen, or otherwise ineligible voters had cast ballots, or that voting machines had changed votes for the defendant to votes for Biden. By the way, I'm blanking on the name of the company that makes those voting machines, but if I'm not mistaken, they were suing either Trump himself or the Trump campaign for defamation, for how much he was lying about the veracity of their voting machines. These claims were false, and the defendant knew they were false. In fact, the defendant was notified repeatedly that his claims were untrue, often by the people on whom he relied for candid advice on important matters and who were best positioned to know the facts, and he deliberately disregarded the truth. For instance, the defendant's vice president, who personally stood to gain by remaining in office as part of the defendant's ticket, and whom the defendant asked to study fraud allegations, told the defendant that he had seen no evidence of outcome determinative fraud. The senior leaders of the Justice Department, appointed by the defendant and responsible for investigating credible allegations of election crimes, told the defendant on multiple occasions that various allegations of fraud were unsupported. The Director of National Intelligence, the defendant's principal advisor on intelligence matters related to national security, disabused the defendant of the notion that the intelligence community's findings regarding foreign interference would change the outcome of the election. The Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, whose existence the defendant signed into law to protect the nation's cybersecurity infrastructure from attack, joined an official multi-agency statement that there was no evidence any voting system had been compromised and that declared the 2020 election the most secure in American history. Days later, after CISA director who the defendant had appointed announced publicly that election security experts were in agreement that claims of computer-based election fraud were unsubstantiated, the defendant fired him. Senior White House attorneys selected by the defendant to provide him candid advice informed the defendant that there was no evidence of outcome-determinative election fraud and told him that his presidency would end on Inauguration Day 2021. Something I want to note is while these are all just people telling him a thing, and you might say, like, oh, well, just because someone says a thing doesn't mean they're right about it. These are people with reason to say it. Like, Mike Pence is just saying it because, like, whatever, he trusts what people have told him. But, like, the CISA director is saying it because his agency has determined that there was not fraud. It's not, oh, he just thinks that or he believes it. It's that they investigated and determined the authenticity of the results. Senior staffers of the defendant's 2020 re-election campaign, defendant's campaign or campaign, whose sole mission was the defendant's re-election, told the defendant on November 7, 2020 that he had only a 5 to 10% chance of prevailing in the election and that the success was contingent on the defendant winning ongoing vote counts or litigation in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. Within a week of that assessment, the defendant lost in Arizona, meaning that he had lost the election. Something I also want to remind everyone is notice that all of the claims of election fraud were in swing states. They weren't like, oh, there were, I don't know, 100,000 fake votes in California or whatever, even a million fake. Like, they didn't say anything like that because it didn't matter, because the point wasn't that there was fraud. The point was they wanted to win. Trump wanted to win the election or to have been to be president, irrespective of the will of the electorate. This is why the only claims of fraud ever occurred by their campaign in swing states. It's because they don't care. They only care about remaining in power. State legislators and officials, many of whom were the defendant's political allies, had voted for him and wanted him to be reelected, repeatedly informed the defendant that his claims of fraud in their states were unsubstantiated or false and resisted his pressure to act based upon them. Something I wonder about, by the way, as we were talking about, like, as I was mentioning, like, how close we were to things going very poorly, is I was wondering, what if a Republican governor just selected a different group of electors, right? The governor had to sign off that these are who the electors are. What if they just signed a group of people who would vote in a different way? I'm guessing that's illegal, but again, that needs to be enforced, and it's the kind of thing that I don't imagine has happened before. State and federal courts, the neutral arbiters responsible for neutral arbiters, my ass, but I get why they're going to say this. Responsible for ensuring the fair and even-handed administration of election laws, rejected every outcome determinative post-election lawsuit filed by the defendant, his co-conspirators, and allies, providing the defendant real-time notice that his allegations were meritless. Of course, by this point, he already knew they were meritless. And you can tell by their actions, because what they were claiming to the public was a wide swath of fraud that they were not taking to court. They were trying to stoke their base into a furor based on things they didn't even want to be on the record as claiming. The defendant widely disseminated his false claims of election fraud for months, despite the fact that he knew, and in many cases had been informed directly, that they were not true. The defendant's knowingly false statements were integral to his criminal plans to defeat the federal government function, obstruct the certification, and interfere with others' right to vote and have their votes counted. He made these knowingly false claims throughout the post-election time period, including those below that he made immediately before the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. The defendant insinuated that more than 10,000 dead voters had voted in Georgia. Just 4 days earlier, Governor's Secretary of State had explained to the defendant that this was false. The defendant asserted that there had been 205,000 more votes than voters in Pennsylvania. The defendant's acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general had explained to him that this was false. The defendant said that there had been a suspicious vote dump in Detroit, Michigan. The defendant's attorney general had explained to the defendant that this was false and that the defendant's allies in Michigan state legislature, the Speaker of the House of Representatives and the majority leader of the Senate, had publicly announced that there was no evidence of substantial fraud in the state. The defendant claimed that there had been tens of thousands of double votes and other fraud in Nevada. The Nevada Secretary of State had previously rebutted the defendant's fraud claims by publicly posting a facts versus myth document that Nevada judges had reviewed and rejected them, and that the Nevada Supreme Court had rendered a decision denying such claims. The defendant said that more than 30,000 non-citizens had voted in Arizona. The defendant's own campaign manager had explained to him that such claims are false and that the Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives, who had supported the defendant in the election, had issued a public statement that there was no evidence of substantial fraud in Arizona. The defendant asserted that voting machines in various contested states had switched, notice contestant states, had switched votes from the defendant to Biden. The defendant's attorney general, acting and acting deputy attorney general all had explained to him that this was false, and numerous recounts and audits had confirmed the accuracy of the voting machines. The criminal agreement and acts to the effects of to affect the object of the conspiracy. Shortly after Election Day, which fell on November 3, 2020, the defendant launched his criminal scheme. On November 13th, the defendant's campaign attorneys conceded in court that he had lost the vote count in the state of Arizona, meaning, based on the assessment of the defendant's campaign advisors had given him a week earlier, the defendant had lost the election. So the next day, the defendant turned to co-conspirator 1, whom he had announced would spearhead his efforts going forward to challenge the election results. From that point on, the defendant and his co-conspirators executed a strategy of using knowing deceit in the targeted states to impair, obstruct, and defeat the federal government function, including as described below. On November 13th, the defendant had a conversation with his campaign manager, who informed him that a claim that had been circulating, a substantial number of non-citizens have voted in Arizona, was false. On November 22nd, 8 days before Arizona's governor certified the ascertainment of the state's legitimate electors based on the popular vote, the defendant and co-conspirator 1 called the Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives and made knowingly false claims of election fraud aimed at interfering with the ascertainment of and voting by Arizona's electors as follows. The defendant and co-conspirator 1 falsely asserted, among other things, that a substantial number of non-citizens, non-residents, and dead people had voted fraudulently in Arizona. The Arizona House Speaker asked co-conspirator 1 for evidence of these claims, which co-conspirator 1 did not have, but claimed he would provide. Co-conspirator 1 never did so, obviously. The defendant and co-conspirator 1 asked the Arizona House Speaker to call the legislature into session to hold a hearing based on the claims of election fraud. The Arizona House Speaker refused, stating that doing so would require a two-thirds vote of its members, and he would not allow it without actual evidence of fraud. The defendant and co-conspirator 1 asked the Arizona House Speaker to use the legislature to circumvent the process by which legitimate electors would be ascertained for Biden based on the popular vote, and replace those electors with a new slate for the defendant. The Arizona House Speaker refused, responding that the suggestion was beyond anything he had ever heard or thought of as something within his authority. And it makes me wonder, like, what if he had tried? I'm guessing that wouldn't have worked. And I'm hoping that wouldn't have worked. But it's scary. On December 1st, co-conspirators 1 met with the Arizona House Speaker. When the Arizona House Speaker again asked co-conspirator 1 for evidence of the outcome determinative election fraud he and the defendant had been claiming, co-conspirator 1 responded with words to the effect of, "We don't have the evidence, but we have a lot of theories." On December 4th, the Arizona House Speaker issued a public statement that said, in part, "No election is perfect, and if there were evidence of illegal votes or an improper count, then Arizona law provides a process to contest the election, a lawsuit under state law. But the law does not authorize the legislature to reverse the results of an election. As a conservative Republican, I don't like the results of the presidential election. I voted for President Trump and worked hard to re-elect him, but I cannot and will not entertain a suggestion that we violate current law to change the outcome of a certified election. I and my fellow legislators swore an oath to support the United States Constitution and the Constitution and laws of the state of Arizona. It would violate that oath, the basic principles of Republican government, and the rule of law if we attempted to nullify the people's vote based on unsupported theories of fraud. Under the laws that we wrote and voted upon, Arizona voters choose to who wins and our system requires that their choice be respected. I had a thought about this, and I completely blank on it now. Oh well. On the morning of January 4th, 2021, co-conspirator 2 called the Arizona House Speaker to urge him to use a majority of the legislature to decertify the state's legitimate electors. Oh, that was the thing I was going to that I remembered was, as a note, in addition to these challenges being exclusively in battleground states, what was desired from each of them was very different. When Trump was winning, they wanted all the vote counting to stop, if you remember. But when Trump was losing, they wanted them to count all the Trump votes because they were sure that he was going to come back. And that the votes that were already counted were illegitimate somehow. The the nonsense of their claims makes perfect sense when you realize they don't care about what's true. They care only about remaining in power. And so they'll say whatever they need to get to that end. On the morning of January 4th, co-conspirator 2 called Arizona House Speaker to urge him to use a majority of the legislature to decertify the state's legitimate electors. Arizona's validly ascertained electors had voted 3 weeks earlier and sent their votes to Congress, which was scheduled to count those votes in Biden's favor in just 2 days' time at the January 6th certification proceeding. When the Arizona House Speaker explained that the state investigations had uncovered no evidence of substantial fraud in the state, co-conspirator 2 conceded that he didn't know enough about the facts on the ground in Arizona, but nonetheless told the Arizona House Speaker to decertify and let the courts sort it out. As a note, at this point they already had, and the courts had sorted out that there was not any substantial fraud. The Arizona House Speaker refused, stating that he would not play with the oath he had taken to uphold the United States Constitution and Arizona law. I am very glad that the people in power did that, but it's scary that that was a concern, Again, there are probably legal, just like Trump is being brought up on charges here. These officials might have been able to be brought up on charges for violating their oaths in this way, but that only matters if Trump doesn't just pardon them all, If Trump had been elected and just was like, well, I'm president for life now, and I can do what I want and fuck the rule of law. There are no ramifications for this kind of thing. Now, obviously, at some level, things are always going to land that way. At some level, it doesn't matter what the laws are if nobody follows them. But I guess I don't really have concrete. I'm still developing thoughts on the matter, and I suppose I'm just glad that when it came to these specific individuals who were pressed to do something illegal, that they didn't. Except for the ones clearly who did. On January 6th, the defendant publicly repeated the knowingly false claim that 36,000 non-citizens have voted in Arizona, after being told that there weren't any issues. Something I want to note as we're getting here. So we're on page 12. Unlike the previous indictment, we're not going to see a huge number of pictures or things taken. So this is going to be just a lot of text. I know that might be a little boring, but I think it's important to know all of what's in here. I did find that after if you remember with the last indictment, I decided not to read it, and then found that I really wished I had. And then once we did, I was like, okay, it's better that we did. So it's gonna be a little bit rough going, a little bit dense. We're on page 12 of 45, but we'll get through it, and we'll be glad that we did. All right, so stick with me. I'm glad you're watching. Thanks so much for being here. If you haven't already, I'd be very appreciative if you hit that little follow button. I'm trying to get to partnered on kick. If we do, I'll ruin some tea and make myself drink it. But you all know all that. I'm mostly just taking a break, cooling down, because we got a lot to go. Drinking my tea, which is very good. I love peach tea. Peach is a very good flavor for tea. But hibiscus has been growing on me. It's a really good for iced teas. It's a little bit sour, so you want like other stuff in there, like fruits and stuff. But very very good. I've been liking the hibiscus teas I've been making recently. In any case, on to Georgia. On November 16th, 2020, on the defendant's behalf, his executive assistant sent co-conspirator 3 and others a document containing bullet points critical of a certain voting machine company, writing, "See attached, please include as is or almost as is in lawsuit." Co-conspirator 3 responded 9 minutes later, writing, "It must go in all suits in GA and PA immediately," Georgia and Pennsylvania, "immediately with a fraud claim that requires the entire election to be set aside in those states and the machines impounded for nonpartisan professional inspection." On November 25th, co-conspirator 3 filed a lawsuit against the governor of Georgia, falsely alleging that massive election fraud accomplished through the voting machine company's election software and hardware. Before the lawsuit was even filed, the defendant retweeted a post promoting it. The defendant did this despite the fact that when he had discussed co-conspirator 3's far-fetched public claims regarding the voting machine company in private with advisors, the defendant had conceded that they were unsupported and that co-conspirator 3 sounded crazy. Co-conspirator 3's Georgia lawsuit was dismissed on December 7th. Wow, that's really quick that it was dismissed. But there was no basis to it, so it makes sense. On December 3rd, co-conspirator 1 orchestrated a presentation to the Judiciary Subcommittee of the Georgia State Senate with the intention of misleading state senators into blocking the ascertainment of legitimate electors. During the presentation, an agent of the defendant and co-conspirator 1 falsely claimed that more than 10,000 dead people voted in Georgia. That afternoon, a senior advisor to the defendant told the defendant's chief of staff through text messages, "Just an FYI, a campaign lawyer and his team verified that the 10K plus supposed dead people voting in Georgia is not accurate. It was alleged in co-conspirator 1's hearing today. The senior advisor clarified that he believed that the actual number was 12. 12 people. And by the way, this is something that's not necessarily fraudulent. If someone mails in their ballot and then dies while it's in the mail, it's not a fraudulent vote. They voted completely legally. Whether that vote should be counted is a different issue, but it's not voter fraud, or it's not election fraud, even though it is a vote from a dead person. Another agent of the defendant and co-conspirator 1 played a misleading excerpt of a video recording of a ballot counting at State Farm Arena in Atlanta and insinuated that it showed election workers counting suitcases of illegal ballots. Co-conspirator 2, and just a reminder, because I'm not going to get... All of these have been... If it doesn't say so in this indictment, which most of the time it does, all of these have been disproven, debunked, all that stuff. Co-conspirator 2 encouraged the legislators to certify the state's legitimate electors based on false allegations of election fraud. Also on December 3rd, the defendant issued a tweet amplifying the knowingly false claims made in co-conspirator 1's presentation in Georgia. Wow, blockbuster testimony taking place right now in Georgia. Ballot stuffing by Dems when Republicans were forced to leave the large counting room. Plenty more coming, but this alone leads to an easy win of the state. On December 4th, the Georgia Secretary of State's chief operating officer debunked the claims made at co-conspirator 1's presentation the previous day, issuing a tweet stating, "The 90-second video of election workers at State Farm Arena purporting to show fraud was watched in its entirety, hours, by Georgia Secretary of State investigators. Shows normal ballot processing. Here is the fact check on it. On December 7th, he reiterated during a press conference that the claim that there had been misconduct at State Farm Arena was false." At this moment, I also want to note that, like, obviously, the people who were attacking the Capitol on January 6th or his other fervent fans probably often don't know or care about these claims that they were false. They'll dismiss anything as conspiracy, even finding out that Trump didn't believe it either, because they're so like, it's they've drunk the Kool-Aid at this point, or they just don't care. A lot of the people, especially like the fascists, do not care what the truth of the matter is. They want the power, and if it's like, okay, if the election thing didn't work out, then we'll just attack the Capitol or whatever else. So it's not particularly useful to try to convince them. I don't want to like give up on it entirely. That's why we're doing things like this, but it is disheartening a little bit to be like, yeah, some number of people will not listen to literally any evidence. But it's that thing that comes up, right? You cannot logic someone out of a position they didn't logic their way into. On December 8th, the defendant called the Georgia Attorney General to pressure him to support an election lawsuit filed in the Supreme Court by another state's Attorney General. The Georgia Attorney General told the defendant that officials had investigated various claims of election fraud in the state and were not seeing evidence to support them. Also on January 8th, a senior campaign advisor who spoke with the defendant on a daily basis and had informed him on multiple occasions that various fraud claims were untrue, expressed frustrations that many of co-conspirator 1 and his legal team's claims could not be substantiated. As early as mid-November, for instance, the senior campaign advisor had informed the defendant that his claims of a large number of dead voters in Georgia were untrue. With respect to the persistent false claim regarding State Farm Arena on December 8th, the senior campaign advisor wrote in an email, "When our research and campaign legal team can't back up any of the claims made by our elite strike force legal team, you can see why we're 0-32 on our cases. I'll obviously hustle to help you on all fronts, but it's tough to own any of this when it's all just conspiracy shit beamed down from the mothership." On December 10th, 4 days before Biden's validly ascertained electors were scheduled to cast votes and send them to Congress, co-conspirator 1 appeared at a hearing before the Georgia House of Representatives Government Affairs Committee. Co-conspirator 1 played the State Farm Arena video again and falsely claimed that it showed voter fraud right in front of people's eyes, and it was the tip of the iceberg. As a note, remember at this point, he's not only does he know that there's no fraud happening in this video, he's been told as much and rebuffed on it by other people. So they don't even care that they know they're lying and don't care that they're lying, right? It's not that they just believed a thing that's untrue. They know it's not true. I guess that's already been claimed, but like the depth of how much they do not care about the truth is pretty relevant here. Then he cited 2 election workers by name, baselessly accused them of quite obviously surreptitiously passing around USB ports as if they are vials of heroin or cocaine, and suggested they were criminals whose places of work, their homes, should have been searched for evidence of ballots, for evidence of USB ports, for evidence of voter fraud. Thereafter, the 2 election workers received numerous death threats. So yeah, actively, blatantly ruining people's lives for doing nothing wrong. But they don't care, right? That's just people to throw under the bus. Every conspiracy needs a scapegoat, right? And this happened to a lot of people. On December 15th, the defendant summoned the incoming acting attorney general, the incoming acting deputy attorney general, and others to the Oval Office to discuss allegations of election fraud. During the meeting, the Justice Department officials specifically refuted the defendant's claims about State Farm Arena, explaining to him that the activity shown on the tape co-conspirator 1 had used was benign. On December 23rd, a day after the defendant's chief of staff personally observed the signature verification process at the Cobb County Civic Center and notified the defendant that the state election officials were conducting themselves in an exemplary fashion and would find fraud if it existed, the defendant tweeted that the Georgia officials administering the signature verification process were trying to hide evidence of election fraud and were terrible people. In a phone call on December 27th, the defendant spoke with acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general. During the call, the defendant again pressed the unfounded claims that regarding State Farm Arena, and the 2 top Justice Department officials again rebutted the allegations, telling him that the Justice Department had reviewed videotape and interviewed witnesses and had not identified any suspicious conduct. On December 31st, the defendant signed a verification affirming false election fraud allegations made on his behalf in a lawsuit filed with his name against the Georgia governor. In advance of the filing, co-conspirator 2, who was advising the defendant on the lawsuit, acknowledged in an email that he and the defendant had, since signing the previous verification, been made aware that some of the allegations and evidence proffered by the experts had been inaccurate, and that signing a new affirmation with that knowledge and incorporation by reference would not be accurate. The defendant and co-conspirator 2 caused the defendant to signed verification to be filed nonetheless. On January 2nd, 4 days before Congress's certification proceeding, the defendant and others called Georgia's Secretary of State. During the call, the defendant lied to the Georgia Secretary of State to induce him to alter Georgia's popular vote count and call into question the validity of the Biden electors' votes, which had been transmitted to Congress weeks before, including as follows. The defendant raised allegations regarding the State Farm Arena video and repeatedly disparaged one of the same election workers that co-conspirator 1 had maligned on December 10th, using her name almost 20 times and falsely referring to her as a professional vote scammer and hustler. In response, the Georgia Secretary of State refuted this. You're talking about the State Farm video, and I think it's extremely unfortunate that co-conspirator 1 or his people, they sliced and diced the video and took it out of context. When the Georgia Secretary of State then offered a link to a video that would disprove co-conspirator 1's claims, the defendant responded, "I don't care about a link. I don't need it. I have much, Georgia Secretary of State, I have a much better link." He doesn't care. Yeah. I mean, this is really common. Fascists just don't care about what's true. That's not something that matters to them. The defendant asked about rumors that paper ballots cast in the election were being destroyed and that the Georgia Secretary of State's counsel explained to him that the claim had been investigated and was not true. The defendant claimed that 5,000 dead people voted in Georgia. Notice how the number also keeps changing, because obviously it was never a true claim. Causing the Georgia Secretary of State to respond, "Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong. The actual number were two. Two people that were dead and voted. And so your information's wrong, and that was two. Two people." But he's going to claim 5,000 or 10,000 or 6,000 or whatever other numbers he said. The defendant claimed that thousands of out-of-state voters had cast ballots in Georgia's election, which the Georgia Secretary of State's counsel refuted, explaining, "We've been going through each of those as well, and those numbers that we got, that defendant's counsel was just saying, they're not accurate. Every one we've been through are people that lived in Georgia, moved to a different state, but then moved back to Georgia legitimately. They moved back in years ago. This was not like something just before the election." In response to multiple other defendants' allegations, the Georgia Secretary of State's counsel told the defendant that the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was examining all such claims and finding no merit to them. The defendant said that he needed to find 11,780 votes, and insinuated that the Georgia Secretary of State and his counsel would be subject to criminal prosecution if they failed to find election fraud as he demanded, stating, "And you are going to find that they are, which is totally illegal. It's more illegal for you than it is for them because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense. And you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and the Georgia Secretary of State's counsel, your lawyer." I didn't know about that part of the phone call. The quote-unquote perfect phone call where he was like, "Hey, listen, I just need you to find them. Maybe those votes fill off a truck. And I just need you to find the votes. And it'd be a shame if legal proceedings happened to you. It's literally just a shakedown." I know that might have been the worst accent that's ever been, and good. The next day, on January 3rd, the defendant falsely claimed that the Georgia Secretary of State had not addressed the defendant's allegations, publicly stating that the Georgia Secretary of State was unwilling or unable to answer questions such as the ballots under the table scam, ballot destruction, or out-of-state voters, dead voters, and more. He has no clue. On January 6th, the defendant publicly repeated the knowingly false insinuation that more than 10,300 dead people have voted in Georgia. Notice every time the number is different. And it's not like, oh, they're just refining the number. They said 10,000, but they were rounding up and it was like 9,700 or whatever. Like, it was 5,000 just, a couple weeks before. When did he say that? January 2nd? Yeah, just a couple of days before the number was 5,000 according to him. Michigan. On November 5th, 2020, the defendant claimed that there had been a suspicious dump of votes, purportedly illegitimate ballots, stating, "In Detroit, there were hours of unexplained delay in delivering many of the votes for counting. The final batch did not arrive until 4 in the morning, and, even though the polls closed at 8 o'clock..." Oh. Okay, yeah, we're reading Trump quotes, so obviously the grammar is going to be nonsense. So they brought it in, and the batches came in, and nobody knew where they were from. Obviously, there are a lot of mechanisms in place to ensure that ballots aren't tampered with between where they came from and where they arrived. Obviously. On November 20th, 3 days before Michigan's governor signed a certificate of ascertainment notifying the federal government that, based on the popular vote, Biden's electors were to represent Michigan's voters, the defendant held a meeting in the Oval Office with the Speaker of the Michigan House of Representatives and the Majority Leader of the Michigan Senate. In the meeting, the defendant raised his false claim, among others, of an illegitimate vote dump in Detroit. In response, the Michigan Senate Majority Leader told the defendant that he had lost Michigan not because of fraud, but because the defendant had underperformed with certain voter populations in the state. Upon leaving the meeting, the Michigan House Speaker and Michigan Senate Majority Leader issued a statement reiterating this. The Senate and House Oversight Committees are actively engaged in a thorough review of Michigan's elections process, and we have faith in the committee process to provide greater transparency and accountability to our citizens. We have not yet been made aware of any information that would change the outcome of the election in Michigan, and as legislative leaders, we will follow the law and follow the normal process regarding Michigan's electors, just as we have said throughout this election. On December 1st, the defendant raised his Michigan vote dump claim with the Attorney General, who responded that what had occurred in Michigan had been normal vote counting process and there was no indication of fraud in Detroit. Despite this, the next day, the defendant made a knowingly false statement that in Michigan, at 6:31 in the morning, a vote dump of 149,772 votes came in unexpectedly. We were winning by a lot. That batch was received in horror. Nobody knows anything about it. It's corrupt. Detroit is corrupt. I have a lot of friends in Detroit. Of course, Trump is just going to throw in, like, I haven't talked about myself in a bit. I have friends in Detroit. They know it, but Detroit is totally corrupt. Yeah, God, he's such a narcissist. It's absurd. On December 4th, co-conspirator 1 sent a text message to the Michigan House Speaker reiterating his unsupported claim of election fraud and attempting to get the Michigan House Speaker to assist in reversing the ascertainment of the legitimate Biden electors, stating, "Looks like Georgia may well hold some factual hearings and change the certification under," does that say Art 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution? As co-conspirator 2 explained, they don't just have the right to do it, but the obligation. Help me get this done in Michigan. Similarly, on December 7th, despite having established no fraud in Michigan, co-conspirator 1 sent a text intended for the Michigan State Senate Majority Leader. "So I need you to pass a joint resolution from the Michigan legislature that states that the election is in dispute. There's an ongoing investigation by the legislature, and the electors sent by the Governor Whitmer are not the..." Oh, okay, these are bullet points. Okay. "The electors sent by Governor Whitmer are not the official electors of the state of Michigan and do not fall within the safe harbor deadline of December 8th under Michigan law." On December 14th, the day the electors in states across the country were required to vote and submit their votes to Congress, the Michigan House Speaker and Michigan Senate Majority Leader announced that, contrary to the defendant's requests, they would not decertify the legitimate election results or electors in Michigan. The Michigan Senate Majority Leader's public statement included, We have not received evidence of fraud on the scale that would change the outcome of the election in Michigan. The Michigan House Speaker's public statement read, in part, "We've diligently examined these reports of fraud to the best of our ability. I fought hard for President Trump. Nobody wanted him to win more than me. I think he's done an incredible job. But I love our republic too, and I can't fathom risking our norms, traditions, and institutions to pass a resolution retroactively changing the electors for Trump simply because some think there might have been enough widespread fraud to give him the win. That's unprecedented for good reason, and that's why there is not enough support in the House to cast a new slate of electors. I fear we'd lose our country forever. This truly would bring mutually assured destruction for every future election in regards to the Electoral College, and I can't stand for that. I won't." Now, I agree about the ramifications. It would, the voting would not, there would be no voting after that. If this could be the case, there just wouldn't be a democracy anymore. I don't think it's it's not a destruction of like the Electoral College or whatever, but it sets a precedent of you can just wield your power to announce who won the election. This is the kind of thing authoritarians do all the time. They'll just like, we had an election, I won. Did you want to like see the votes? No, I won. 99%. 99% votes for me. You can just do that. On January 6, 2021, the defendant publicly repeated his knowingly false claim regarding an illicit dump of more than 100,000 ballots in Detroit. Pennsylvania. On November 11, 2020, the defendant publicly maligned a Philadelphia city commissioner for stating on the news that there was no evidence of widespread fraud in Philadelphia. As a result, Philadelphia city commissioner and his family received death threats. Oh boy. On November 25th, the day after Pennsylvania's governor signed a certificate of ascertainment and thus certified the federal government that Biden's electors were the legitimate electors for the state, co-conspirator 1 orchestrated an event at a hotel in Gettysburg attended by state legislators. Co-conspirator 1 falsely claimed that Pennsylvania had issued 1.8 million absentee ballots and received 2.5 million in return. He's alleging 700,000 fraudulent votes at a minimum. That's an absurd number. But notice these numbers are all over the place. The reason, well, I mean, I guess they would be in these states, but like, yeah, it's because they want enough to overturn the election, right? Wouldn't 10,000 be a big deal? Well, Pennsylvania's too big for it to have changed the results, so they wouldn't care. They would only care, and they're only claiming that's so high because they want to overturn the election. That's the only aim here, and I hope that's clear. In the days thereafter, a campaign staffer wrote internally that co-conspirator 1's allegation was just wrong, and there's no way to defend it. The deputy campaign manager responded, "We have been saying this for a while. It's very frustrating." On December 4th, after 4 Republican leaders of the Pennsylvania legislature issued a public statement that the General Assembly lacked the authority to overturn the popular vote and appoint its own slate of electors, and that doing so would violate the state election code and constitution, the defendant retweeted a post labeling the legislators cowards. On December 31st and January 3rd, the defendant repeatedly raised with the acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general the allegation that in Pennsylvania there had been 205,000 more votes than voters. Each time, the Justice Department officials informed the defendant that his claim was false. On January 6th, the defendant publicly repeated his knowingly false claim that there had been 205,000 more votes than voters in Pennsylvania. So a couple of things I want to note here as we're going through the different states, and just to take a pause in reading this because it is a lot. We're almost halfway though. Is note that it's not just that he's lying about these results, which sadly, I don't know about sadly, but like it perturbs me a little bit. But is your First Amendment right? You have the right to lie. There's no law against that. There are instances where it can be illegal, but by and large, you're allowed to lie. The problem isn't just that he was lying, right? Notice in each case that we're going over, he lied and then followed that up with trying to illegally overturn the election through approaching the state legislature or the state governor or whatever, trying to trying to get actions taken on the basis of these lies. I also find it I find it pretty worthwhile and pretty relevant that each of these sections concludes with, here's how that culminated at January 6th or on January 6th. And here's how it like implies that like here's how that stoked this assault on the Capitol. We'll see how much that goes forward as being particularly relevant for. We'll see how much this indictment holds Trump responsible for those events. But I do think it's, even if this indictment says nothing about Trump being the cause of January 6th, which I think he was, I think it's worthy for us to know, to pay attention to, like, they these were all leading to this moment. Even if, because some people were like, well, what he said on January 6th wasn't necessarily, well, no, it wasn't just January 6th. It had been for months. He'd been stoking this, and it all led to this moment. They were all these lines draw in to that one moment where he gets everyone mad with the thing they've been mad about for months, the lies that he fed them for them to believe and think that their country was being overrun and whatever, and then pointed them at the Capitol. Wisconsin. On November 29th, 2020, a recount in Wisconsin that the defendant's campaign had petitioned and paid for did not change the election result, and in fact increased the defendant's margin of defeat. Yeah, that was pretty funny, by the way. Yeah, some of the recounts he demanded, it was like, oh, you're right. We didn't have the count right. You actually lost more than we thought. Thanks, man. It was very embarrassing for him, and good. I'm glad it was embarrassing. On December 14th, the Wisconsin Supreme Court rejected an election challenge by the campaign. One justice wrote, "Nothing in this case casts any legitimate doubt that the people of Wisconsin lawfully chose Vice President Biden and Senator Harris to be the next leaders of our great country." On December 21st, as a result of the state's Supreme Court's decision, the Wisconsin governor, who had signed a certificate of ascertainment on November 30th, identifying Biden's electors as the state's legitimate electors, signed a certificate of final determination in which he recognized that the state Supreme Court had resolved a controversy regarding the appointment of Biden's electors, and confirmed that Biden had received the highest number of votes in the state and that his electors were the state's legitimate electors. That same day, in response to the court decision that had prompted... By the way, would it be weird, do you think, if in a state, instead of just like the popular vote gets the totality of it, would it be weird to be like, okay, well, this state has 20 electoral votes, and we'll say 60% of the electorate voted for candidate A, so they'll get 60% of the electoral votes, and then 35% went to candidate B, so they'll get 35 of the electoral vote. Like, isn't that even a little bit better than what we have? It doesn't solve all the problems, but wouldn't that be at the very least a slight improvement? That same day, in response to the court decision that had prompted the Wisconsin governor to sign a certificate of final determination, the defendant issued a tweet repeating his knowingly false claim of election fraud and demanding that the Wisconsin legislature overturn the election results that had led to the ascertainment of Biden's electors as legitimate electors. On December 27th, the defendant raised with the acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general a specific fraud claim that there had been more votes than voters in Wisconsin, dusting off one he had used prior. The acting deputy attorney general informed the defendant that the claim was false. On January 6th, the defendant publicly repeated knowingly false claims that there had been tens of thousands of unlawful votes in Wisconsin. So now we've finished with the state-specific claims. Now we have the defendant's use of dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to organize fraudulent slates of electors and cause them to transmit false certificates to Congress. As the defendant's attempts to obstruct... And, like, one thing to ask yourself is, like, let's say, like, put yourself in Trump's shoes. You were running for office. Even if you... Like, let's pretend that he believed these claims, that the election was illegitimate. Would your thought on how to approach that issue to be like, all right, so I'm going to, like, call the speakers of the House in each of these states and get them to do something illegal to say that I won instead because I was supposed to? Is that really, like, Why would that be the mechanism? I know I mentioned this already, but like remind yourself periodically. It's like there's no reason to do this, even if he wasn't lying. As the defendant's attempts to obstruct the electoral vote through deceit of state officials met with repeated failure, beginning in early December 2020, he and co-conspirators developed a new plan to marshal individuals who would have served as the defendant's electors. He had he won the popular vote in 7 targeted states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and cause those individuals to make and send to the vice president and Congress false certifications that they were legitimate electors. Under the plan, the submission of these fraudulent slates would create a fake controversy at the certification proceeding and position the vice president, presiding on January 6th as president of the Senate, to supplant legitimate electors with the defendant's fake electors and certify the defendant as president. Again, why would this be the course of action had there actually been voter fraud? Really think about it. Why, like, I know we'll do a criminal conspiracy to fight the criminal conspiracy. Why would this be the mechanism? And if you really think the conspiracy is so thorough that everyone's in on it, no one will side with you, why would you think they would side with you in Congress, right? It's like it's literally everyone has to be in on it, which makes it obviously untrue. And if they weren't in on it, that would be the only way this would work anyway. It's very, very, very ridiculous. The plan capitalized on ideas presented in memoranda drafted by co-conspirator 5, an attorney who was assisting the defendant's campaign with legal efforts related to a recount in Wisconsin. The memoranda evolved over time from a legal strategy to preserve the defendant's rights to a corrupt plan to subvert the federal government function by stopping Biden electors' votes from being counted and certified as follows. So all of these will be how they tried to like get their fake electors to vote instead of the Biden ones. Or in addition to, I guess. The November 18th memorandum, Wisconsin memo, advocated that because of the ongoing recount in Wisconsin, the defendant's electors there should meet and cast votes on December 14th, the date the ECA required appointed electors to vote, to preserve the alternative of the defendant's Wisconsin elector slate in the event the defendant ultimately prevailed in the state. That's not how that works. If Trump had ultimately prevailed after the recount, you don't have them vote ahead of time. You just go like, okay, I'm sure there's something to do for that, right? Before January 6th, they'll have some solution to that problem. You wouldn't just have them send their vote. We obviously know how they, it's, I don't know. It's very weird. I don't know enough specifically about the law to know what would happen, but it definitely would not be this is the recourse. The December 6th memorandum, fraudulent elector memo, marked a sharp departure from co-conspirator 5's Wisconsin memo, advocating that the alternate electors originally conceived of to preserve rights in Wisconsin instead be used in a number of states as fraudulent electors to prevent Biden from receiving the 270 electoral votes necessary to secure the presidency on January 6th. The fraudulent elector memo suggested that the defendant's electors in 6 purportedly contested states, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, should meet and mimic as best as possible the actions of the legitimate Biden electors, and that on January 6th, the vice president should open and count the fraudulent votes, setting up a fake controversy that would derail the proper certification of Biden as president-elect. Yeah, just imagine there are 538 electoral votes, and he opens one, and they end up counting, 600 something votes. That would be an issue. Things would get real weird, and that's what he was trying to orchestrate. The December 9th memorandum, fraudulent elector instructions, consisted of co-conspirator 5's instructions on how fraudulent electors should mimic legitimate electors in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Co-conspirator 5 noted that in some states it would be virtually impossible for the fraudulent electors to successfully take the same steps as the legitimate electors because state law required formal participation in the process by state officials or access to official resources. The plan began in early December, and ultimately the conspirators and the defendant's campaign took the Wisconsin memo and expanded it to any state that the defendant claimed was contested, even New Mexico, which the defendant had lost by more than 10% of the popular vote. This expansion was forecast by emails the defendant's chief of staff sent on December 6th, forwarding the Wisconsin memo to campaign staff and writing, "We just need to have someone coordinating the electors for states." On December 6th, the defendant and co-conspirator 2 called the chairwoman of the Republican National Committee to ensure that the plan was in motion. During the call, co-conspirator 2 told the chairwoman that it was important for the RNC to help the defendant's campaign gather electors in targeted states, and falsely represented to her that such electors' votes would be used only if ongoing litigation in one of the states changed the results of the defendant's favor. After the RNC chairwoman consulted the campaign and heard that work on gathering electors was underway, she called and reported this information to the defendant, who responded approvingly. So yeah, he was also lying to these people to get them on board. He was telling them, well, yeah, like in case like it ends up going my way, that's the only time we'll use these. But no, he had intended to use them to delegitimize the votes counted on January 6th. It didn't matter, he just needed the fake votes in there. And so he's willing to say whatever it is. Remember, let's pretend again that what he was claiming was true. Why would you be lying to people to get them to do stuff and have this conspiratorial plot? Why would you do any of this if you believed there was voter fraud? Obviously he didn't. And he stated he didn't, but it's just one of those, like, it's not just that he said it, he's also acting like he didn't believe it. On December 7th, co-conspirator 1 received the Wisconsin memo and the fraudulent elector memo. Co-conspirator 1 spoke with co-conspirator 6 regarding attorneys who could assist in the fraudulent elector effort in the targeted states, and he received from co-conspirator 6 an email identifying attorneys in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. The next day, on December 8th, co-conspirator 5 called the Arizona attorney on co-conspirator 6's list. In an email after the call, the Arizona attorney recounted his conversation with co-conspirator 5 as follows. "I just talked to the gentleman who did that memo," co-conspirator 5. "His idea is basically that all of us, Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona, Pennsylvania, etc., have our electors send in their votes, even though the votes aren't legal under federal law because they're not signed by the governor, so that members of Congress can fight about whether they should be counted on January 6th. They could potentially argue that they're not bound by the federal law because they're Congress and make the laws, etc. Kind of wild / creative. I'm happy to discuss." Ooh. "My comment to him was that I guess there's no harm in it, legally at least, i.e. we would just be sending in fake electoral votes to Pence so that someone in Congress could make an objection when they start counting votes and start arguing the fake votes should be counted." So yeah, orchestrating the objections for Congress to raise. Remember, there's that portion where, like, very notably after the insurrection, when they came back to count the votes, there were still objections to these things. They were trying to manufacture reasons for objections by having fake votes in there and being like, well, maybe we just count the fake ones instead. Again, subverting the electoral process. At co-conspirator 1's direction on December 10th, co-conspirator 5 sent to points of contact in all targeted states except Wisconsin, which had already received his memos, and New Mexico a streamlined version of the Wisconsin memo, which did not reveal the intended fraudulent use of the defendant's electors and the fraudulent elector instructions, along with fraudulent elector certificates that he had drafted. The next day, on December 11th, through co-conspirator 5, co-conspirator 1 suggested that the Arizona lawyer file a petition for certiorari? No idea. In the Supreme Court as a pretext to claim that litigation was pending in the state, to provide cover for the convening and voting of the defendant's fraudulent electors there. Co-conspirator 5 explained that co-conspirator 1 had heard from a state official and state provisional elector that it could appear treasonous for the Arizona electors to vote on Monday if there was no pending court proceeding. Treasonous is a good word there. To manage the plan in Pennsylvania on December 12th, co-conspirator 1, co-conspirator 5, and co-conspirator 6 participated in a conference call organized by the defendant's campaign with the defendant's electors in that state. When the defendant's electors expressed concern about signing certificates representing themselves as legitimate electors. Co-conspirator 1 falsely assured them that their certificates would be used only if the defendant succeeded in litigation. Not just falsely, but he knew that they were going to be used no matter what. Subsequently, co-conspirator 6 circulated proposed conditional language to that effect for potential inclusion in the fraudulent elector certificates. A campaign official cautioned not to offer the conditional language to other states because the other states are signing what he prepared. If it gets out we change the language for Pennsylvania, it could snowball. In some cases, the defendant's electors refused to participate in the plan. That it's only some is kind of worrying. Some people tried to go along with it. Now they were deceived, but still. I wonder how someone becomes an elector in that way. I'm sure there's rhyme and reason to it, but it's the kind of thing I have no idea about. On December 13th, co-conspirator 5 sent co-conspirator 1 an email memorandum that further confirmed that the conspirators' plan was not to use the fraudulent electors only in the circumstance that the defendant's litigation was successful in one of the targeted states. Instead, the plan was to falsely present the fraudulent slates as an alternative to the legitimate slates at Congress's certification proceeding. On December 13th, the defendant asked the senior campaign advisor for an update on what's going on with the elector plan and directed him to put out a statement on electors. As a result, co-conspirator 1 directed the senior campaign advisor to join a conference call with him, co-conspirator 6, and others. When the senior campaign advisor related these developments in text messages to the deputy campaign manager, a senior advisor to the defendant, and a campaign staffer, the deputy campaign manager responded, "Here's the thing. The way this is morphed, it's crazy. It's a crazy place, so I don't know who wants to put their name on it." The senior advisor wrote, "Certifying illegal votes." In turn, the participants in the group text message refused to have a statement regarding electors attributed to their names because none of them could stand by it. Also on December 13th, at a campaign staffer's request, co-conspirator 5 drafted and sent fraudulent elector certificates for the defendant's electors in New Mexico, which had not previously been among the targeted states, and where there was no pending litigation on the defendant's behalf. The next day, the defendant's campaign filed an election challenge. So remember, let's go back to like the idea that maybe that even if this was the case, why would you act this way? If the point was to have the Trump electors, just in case the litigation went his way in that state, why are they being sent to a state he had no litigation in? Obviously, it was just to delegitimize the election. That was his goal, which is what he's on trial for. The next day, the defendant's campaign filed an election challenge suit in New Mexico at 11:54 a.m., 6 minutes before the noon deadline for the electors' votes, as a pretext so that there was pending litigation there at the time the fraudulent electors voted. Wow. The shamelessness is overwhelming. These are the actions of someone who is not used to the concept of he's used to thinking of himself as the best and smartest, and always everything works for him because he's been like, he's so wealthy. That's just kind of how his life is. And being like, this is how that looks. We see that with Musk as well. Like when they don't have the handrails, no, they're pretty dumb. This is like obvious. Obviously this was going to be seen through, and now we're seeing the repercussions. I'm very glad for that. On December 14th, the legitimate electors of all 50 states and the District of Columbia met in their respective jurisdictions to formally cast their votes for president, resulting in a total of 232 electoral votes for the defendant and 306 for Biden. The legitimate electoral votes that Biden won in the states that the defendant targeted and the defendant's margin of defeat were as follows: Arizona, 11 electoral votes, 10,457 votes. Georgia, 16 electoral votes, 11,779 votes. Michigan, 16 electoral votes, 154,188 votes. Nevada, 6 electoral votes, 33,596 votes. New Mexico, 5 electoral votes, 99,720 votes. Pennsylvania, 20 electoral votes, 80,555 votes, and Wisconsin 10 electoral votes, 20,682 votes. Something I want to note about some of these. Now with Pennsylvania, the amount of like fraudulent votes claimed was in a magnitude of hundreds of thousands, so it's not really the case there. But like in Georgia, he claimed 10,000 dead people voted. You still lost. Even if we assume that's true and that all of them voted for Biden, you still lost by 1,700 votes, about like yeah 1,779 votes. So like, even again, even if he thought this was real, it's nonsense. Even if he thought that there were 10,000 legal votes, you still lost, irrespective of that. Now, obviously, there weren't. There were two, two votes from dead people, but like, notice the ridiculousness. It's not about actual voter fraud. It never was, obviously, and I will continue to beat this dead horse as we read this. No, it's just he just wanted the election to go the other way, and he'll make up whatever reason. You'll start with something with, the pretense of legal legitimacy, but he doesn't care, as we see with him trying to supplant the electors. On the same day, at the direction of the defendant and co-conspirator 1, fraudulent electors convened sham proceedings in the 7 targeted states to cast fraudulent electoral ballots in favor of the defendant. In some states, in order to satisfy legal requirements set forth for legitimate electors under state law, state officials were enlisted to provide the fraudulent electors access to state capitol buildings so that they could gather and vote there. In many cases, however, as co-conspirator 5 had predicted in the fraudulent elector instructions, the fraudulent electors were unable to satisfy the legal requirements. Because remember, they weren't certified, because they weren't legitimate electors. Nonetheless, as directed in the fraudulent elector instructions, shortly after the fraudulent electors met on December 14th, the targeted states' fraudulent elector certificates were mailed to the President of the Senate, the Archivist of the United States, and others. The defendant and co-conspirators ultimately used the certificates of these fraudulent electors to deceitfully target the government function, and did so contrary to how fraudulent electors were told they would be used. Unlike those of fraudulent electors consistent with the ECA, the legitimate electors' signed certificates were annexed to the state executives' certificates of ascertainment before being sent to the President of the Senate and others. By the way, when people worry about like the bloat of bureaucracy, we're seeing right here that bloat protecting us from the overturning of election. Why were these illegitimate electors unable to cast their votes in a way that would be deceitful? Well, because they weren't certified by their states. They didn't have the executive certificate. They weren't sent to the right place. They weren't allowed in the building because all of this bureaucracy, all these layers. Now, I'm not saying bureaucracy is a good thing, but what I'm saying is that it can be. It's like any other tool created by people. It can be used towards positive or negative ends. I guess maybe not any other tool. Racism can't really be used towards positive ends, but you get the point. In this case, in this one instance, I'm glad bureaucracy got in their way. That evening, at 6:26 p.m., the RNC chairwoman forwarded to the defendant through his executive assistant an email titled "Electors Recap Final," which represented that in 6 contested states, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, the defendant's electors had voted in parallel to Biden's electors. The defendant's executive assistant responded, "It's in front of him." So that concludes the portion about him trying to send these slates of fraudulent electors. Now we're getting on to the defendant's attempt to leverage the Justice Department to use deceit to get state officials to replace legitimate electors and electoral votes with the defendants. One thing that's kind of interesting to me is how much we've already talked about conspiracism on this channel. And I'm sure we will going forward because it's all over the place, sadly. But notice this is actually what this is an actual criminal conspiracy happening. And it's not this like obvious thing that you could just like in your bedroom figure out like, oh look, this is odd. This is stuff that we wouldn't necessarily have access to. It's on multiple avenues. We know exactly who the people are. We don't have to be like, well, why don't people know about it? Because it got out. There's pushback. Not everything just goes their way. There's a lot of differences. There's evidence, which is a big deal. Um, just a note. In late December 2020, the defendant attempted to use the Justice Department to make knowingly false claims of election fraud to officials in the targeted states through a formal letter under the acting attorney general's signature, thus giving the defendant's lies the backing of the federal government and attempting to improperly influence the targeted states to replace legitimate Biden electors with the defendants. So now, also leveraging the power of government, like this is literally what an authoritarian does, and what authoritarians do to, like, they leverage their power. It's not because he's right, but because he's powerful. It's something. I'll avoid the tangent. On December 22nd, the defendant met with co-conspirator 4 at the White House. Co-conspirator 4 had not informed his leadership at the Justice Department of the meeting, which was a violation of the Justice Department's written policy restricting contacts with the White House to guard against improper political influence. To guard against literally this exact thing. On December 26th, co-conspirator 4 spoke on the phone with the acting attorney general and lied about the circumstances of his meeting with the defendant at the White House, falsely claiming that the meeting had been unplanned. The acting attorney general directed co-conspirator 4 not to have unauthorized contacts with the White House again, and co-conspirator 4 said he would not. The next morning, on December 27th, contrary to the acting attorney general's direction, co-conspirator 4 spoke with the defendant on the defendant's cell phone for nearly 3 minutes. That afternoon, the defendant called the acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general and said, among other things, "People tell me co-conspirator 4 is great. I should put him in." The defendant also raised multiple false claims of election fraud, which the acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general refused. When the acting attorney general told the defendant that the Justice Department could not and would not change the outcomes of the election, the defendant responded, "Just say that the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman." That statement, by the way, I think is a lot more relevant than it might seem. He's relying on this. It's not just Trump did this thing, is that the mechanisms of the Republican Party align to help him do this thing. You think Marjorie Taylor Greene wouldn't be out there being like, hell yeah, it's corrupt and the Trumps should be president for life, or Boebert or Gates or any of these other people? Even the like establishment Republicans are like a soft maybe at best. It's not just the one person. He's, in a way, a symptom. This didn't start with Trump, nor will it end with him. And that's why we have to be vigilant about attacks on democracy. Because once it goes, it doesn't come back. Or at the very least, the instances where it does come back are violent. And that should be when we should prefer nonviolence, right? I would prefer instead to have a democracy going forward. I think that would be good, actually. I would prefer a more legitimate democracy, honestly, and that could be done legally. But not if there's an authoritarian who takes power, like what was attempted here. On December 28th, co-conspirator 4 sent a draft letter to the acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general, which he proposed that they all sign. The draft was addressed to state officials in Georgia, and co-conspirator 4 proposed sending versions of the letter to elected officials in other targeted states. The proposed letter contained numerous knowingly false claims about the election and the Justice Department, including that the Justice Department had identified significant concerns that may have impacted the outcome of the election in multiple states. The Justice Department believed that in Georgia and other states, 2 valid slates of electors had gathered at the proper location on December 14th, and that both sets of ballots had been transmitted to Congress. That is, co-conspirator 4's letter sought to advance the defendant's fraudulent elector plan by using the authority of the Justice Department to falsely present the fraudulent electors as a valid alternative to the legitimate electors. The Justice Department urged that the state legislature convene a special legislative session to create the opportunity to, among other things, choose the fraudulent electors over the legitimate electors. Now he's like trying to build the Justice Department into his criminal plot. The acting deputy attorney general promptly responded to co-conspirator 4 by by email and told him that his proposed letter was false, writing, "Despite dramatic claims to the contrary, we have not seen the type of fraud that calls into question the reported and certified results of the election." In a meeting shortly thereafter, the acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general again directed co-conspirator 4 not to have unauthorized contact with the White House. Why was this person not subject to disciplinary action? I don't know what that would be in the Justice Department. Maybe there's I don't know if it would be criminal or in employment or employment based, but like that they're just told, hey, to stop doing this thing that you keep doing and clearly are part of. I don't know. I don't understand why there's not disciplinary action being pointed at this person as they repeatedly violate policy. On December 31st, the defendant summoned to the Oval Office acting attorney general, acting deputy attorney general, and other advisors. In this meeting, the defendant again raised claims about election fraud that Justice Department officials already told him were not true, and that the senior Justice Department officials reiterated were false, and suggesting he might change the leadership in the Justice Department, the thing he was known for doing. If someone doesn't agree with him or doesn't work with him, you're fired. Doesn't matter if what they're doing is the right thing. It doesn't matter if you're not on your side. If you're not on his side, he'll throw you out. Tell all his fans to all his fans will come after you, all this stuff, you know. On January 2nd, 2021, just 4 days before Congress's certification proceeding, co-conspirator 4 tried to coerce the acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general to sign and send co-conspirator 4's draft letter, which contained false statements to state officials. He told them that the defendant was considering making co-conspirator 4 the new acting attorney general, but that co-conspirator 4 would decline the defendant's offer if the acting attorney general and acting deputy attorney general would agree to send the proposed letter to the targeted states. The Justice Department officials refused. So now co-conspirator 4 is also... This is basically like a mixed threat and bribe, right? Like, hey, you know, I might have your job, but I might be giving your job if you don't cooperate, but if you do, you know, I'll just turn it down, you know, so you can keep your job. If you do this thing that's illegal... I don't know if that's a threat or a bribe. It's a like gray zone between, but it's not neither of them, I'll tell you that. The next morning, on January 3rd, despite having uncovered no additional evidence of election fraud, co-conspirator 4 sent to a Justice Department colleague an edited version of his draft letter to the states, which included a change from its previous claim that the Justice Department had concerns to a stronger claim that, as of today, there is evidence of significant irregularities that may have impacted the outcome of the election in multiple states. At this point, they also very much know that even the weaker claim was false. But now they're doubling down. 2/3 through. We're almost done. Also, on the morning of January 3rd, co-conspirator 4 met with the defendant at the White House, again without having informed senior Justice Department officials, and accepted the defendant's offer that he become acting attorney general. On the afternoon of January 3rd, co-conspirator 4 spoke with the deputy White House counsel. The previous month, the deputy White House counsel had informed the defendant that there is no option in which you do not have to leave the White House on January 20th. Now the same deputy White House counsel tried to dissuade co-conspirator 4 from assuming the role of acting attorney general. The deputy White House counsel reiterated to co-conspirator 4 that there had not been outcome determinative fraud in the election, and that if the defendant remained in office nonetheless, there would be riots in every major city of the United States. Co-conspirator 4 responded, "Well, deputy White House counsel, that's why there's an Insurrection Act." The overwhelming irony is palpable at that statement. Yeah, wow. By the way, this is something like, not to like make it seem like I'm smart or anything. This is something I had been worried about for kind of a bit before the election, even before the results started coming in. I had mentioned to my friends like concern, like not that Trump wouldn't be elected, but that Biden would be, and Trump would refuse to leave, and we basically saw that because that's just the kind of guy he is. Like he can't come to terms with an idea that he lost. that people prefer not him. His entire identity is an obsession with getting people to like him and think he's the best, right? We've talked about how absolutely unbelievably insecure he is. Could never, there's no world where he's coming to grips with like, oh wow, I lost, moving on. I would be world shattering to him. So of course, he, like, I don't know if he believes that it was illegitimate. Maybe he does in some like really weird way, but obviously he knew what he was saying was untrue. He was told as much, and if he won't factor that in, that's not our problem. Well, it became our problem, but now it's becoming his. Also that afternoon, co-conspirator 4 met with the acting attorney general and told him that the defendant had decided to put co-conspirator 4 in charge of the Justice Department. The acting attorney general responded that he would not accept being fired by a subordinate and immediately scheduled a meeting with the defendant for that evening. On the evening of January 3rd, the defendant met for a briefing on an overseas national security issue with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other national security advisors. The chairman briefed the defendant on the issue, which had previously arisen in December, as well as possible ways the defendant could handle it. When the chairman and another advisor recommended that the defendant take no action because Inauguration Day was only 17 days away, and any course of action could trigger something unhelpful, the defendant calmly agreed, stating, "Yeah, you're right. It's too late for us. We're going to give that to the next guy." So he knows that he's not staying in power, but he's doing this anyway. I guess probably hopeful. The defendant moved immediately from this national security briefing to the meeting that the acting attorney general had requested earlier that day, which included co-conspirator 4, the acting attorney general, the acting deputy attorney general, the Justice Department's assistant attorney general for the Office of Legal Counsel, the White House counsel, a deputy White House counsel, and a senior advisor. At the meeting, the defendant expressed frustration with the acting attorney general for failing to do anything to overturn the election results, and the group discussed co-conspirator 4's plans to investigate purported election fraud and to send his proposed letter to the state officials, a copy of which was provided to the defendant during the meeting. The defendant relented in his plan to replace the acting attorney general with co-conspirator 4 only when he was told that it would result in mass resignations at the Justice Department and of his own White House counsel. At this meeting in the Oval Office on the night of January 3rd, co-conspirator 4 suggested that the Justice Department should opine that the Vice President could exceed his lawful authority during the certification proceedings and change the election outcome. When the Assistant Attorney General for the election of legal counsel began to explain why the Justice Department should not do so, the defendant said, "No one here should be talking to the Vice President. I'm talking to the Vice President," and ended the discussion. So now we've concluded the portion regarding the Justice Department specifically, and now we're getting to the defendant's attempts to enlist the Vice President to fraudulently alter the election results at the January 6th certification proceeding. Notice that he is putting pressure at every place he can think of to try to find a weakness to overturn the election. I'm not sure. I don't want to be so I don't want to catastrophize to the point where I'll say like where I would say that even one of these failing might have ended in a different result. I don't know that's the case, and I don't really believe that it would be, but it's something to note of like this is kind of how authoritarianism works, right? The first guy, when it tries to take hold, first guy just needs to put enough pressure in certain places, and then the next guy can put more pressure, and at some point something breaks. Thankfully, it didn't break here, but we need to shore up our defenses against authoritarianism. One of the ways we can do that is by not voting for them. It's much, much harder for Trump to do this when the law is against him. So you should vote instead for people who aren't fascists and authoritarians. Might I recommend Biden, since he is the most likely person to win in a race against the other authoritarians that exist, like Trump and DeSantis. As the January, and by the way, I don't like Biden. He's just better than a fascist. You know, if there were a better Democratic candidate, maybe I'd be in support of them. From what I've heard of Marianne Williamson, she seems cool, but as I understand it, she's also not likely to garner any support, especially not against an incumbent president. But that's off the point. As the January 6th congressional certification proceeding approached and other efforts to impair, obstruct, and defeat the federal government function failed, the defendant sought to enlist the vice president to use his ceremonial role at the certification to fraudulently alter the election results. The defendant did this first by using knowingly false claims of election fraud to convince the vice president to accept the defendant's fraudulent electors, reject legitimate electoral votes, or send legitimate electoral votes to state legislatures for review rather than count them. When that failed, the defendant attempted to use a crowd of supporters that he had gathered in Washington, D.C. to pressure the vice president to fraudulently alter the election results. On December 19th, 2020, after cultivating widespread anger and resentment for weeks with his knowingly false claim of election fraud, the defendant urged his supporters to travel to Washington on the day of the certification proceeding, tweeting, "Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there, will be wild." Throughout late December, he repeatedly urged his supporters to come to Washington for January 6th. Given that these speeches that the politicians give are often written out in advance. I know Trump speaks off the cuff a lot, but he has a prepared speech. He reads off a teleprompter. It's obvious. He also knew what he was planning. It's not it's one of those he wanted his supporters to come hear this speech where he stokes them into a fervor and points them at the Capitol. Seems very obviously planned, but what do I know? On December 23rd, the defendant retweeted a memo titled Operation Pence Card, which falsely asserted that the vice president could, among other things, unilaterally disqualify legitimate electors from 6 targeted states. On the same day, co-conspirator 2 circulated a 2-page memorandum outlining a plan for the vice president to unlawfully declare the defendant the certified winner of the presidential election. In the memorandum, co-conspirator 2 claimed that 7 states had transmitted 2 slates of electors and proposed that the vice president announce that because of the ongoing disputes in the 7 states, remember, New Mexico had no disputes until 6 minutes before the deadline, just so they could claim that there were disputes. There were no disputes. And the other ones, as we've already seen, were rebuffed. But there were none in New Mexico. There are no electors that can be deemed validly appointed in those states. Next, co-conspirator... Yeah, notice I'll settle for just don't count those states at all, which is openly just anti-democracy. It's not even we should count the legitimate ones. Listen, if you just don't count that, if you just don't listen to those states, who cares what they voted for, you know? Next, co-conspirator 2 proposed steps that he acknowledged violated the ECA, advocating that, in the end, Pence then gavels President Trump as reelected. Just 2 months earlier, on October 11th, co-conspirator 2 had taken the opposite position, writing that neither the Constitution nor the ECA provided the vice president discretion in the counting of electoral votes or permitted him to make determination on his own. On several private phone calls late in December and early January, the defendant repeated knowingly false claims of election fraud and directly pressured the vice president to use his ceremonial role at the certification proceeding on January 6th to fraudulently overturn the results of the election, and the vice president resisted, including on December 25th, when the vice president called the defendant to wish him a Merry Christmas. The defendant quickly turned the conversation to January 6th and requested that the vice president reject electoral votes that day. The vice president pushed back, telling the defendant, as the vice president already had in previous conversation, "You know I don't think I have the authority to change the outcome." On December 29th, as reflected in the vice president's contemporaneous notes, the defendant falsely told the vice president that the Justice Department was finding major infractions. On January 1st, the defendant called the vice president and berated him because he had learned that the vice president had opposed a lawsuit seeking a judicial decision that, at the certification, the vice president had the authority to reject or return votes to the states under the Constitution. The vice president responded that he thought there was no constitutional basis for such authority and that it was improper. In response, the defendant told the vice president, "You're too honest." Within hours of notice the problem isn't that he's wrong, is that he's being honest. The obviousness of this well, I guess dishonesty is overwhelming. Within hours of the conversation, the defendant reminded his supporters to meet in Washington before the certification proceeding, tweeting, "The big protest rally in Washington, D.C. will take place at 11 a.m. on January 6th. Locational details to follow. Stop the steal." And again, the irony of like Trump was the one saying stop the steal while he was trying to steal the election. On January 3rd, the defendant again told the vice president that at the certification proceeding, the vice president had the absolute right to reject electoral votes and the ability to overturn the election. The vice president responded that he had no such authority and that a federal appeals court had rejected the lawsuit making that claim the previous day. So not just that he's wrong and like Pence just doesn't think he has the authority, but no, courts have affirmed that Trump is incorrect in what the vice president is allowed to do, but he wants it done anyway. On January 3rd, the co-conspirator 2 circulated a second memorandum that included a new plan under which, contrary to the ECA, the vice president would send the elector slates to the state legislatures to determine which slate to count. Notice this is like another instance of backing up to the next plan. They initially wanted him to count those illegitimate slates to the exclusion of the legitimate ones. Then it was maybe count both and we'll have the objections. Now it's don't count either, send them back. It's again just one after another. Like how many different attempts they made at overturning this election. We are quite lucky that they were unsuccessful. I don't know that they could have been successful. That's not the point. The point is we should be glad that they were unsuccessful and work in the future to prevent anything like this from happening again. On January 4th, the defendant held a meeting with co-conspirator 2, the vice president's chief of staff, and the vice president's counsel for the purpose of convincing the vice president, based on the defendant's knowingly false claim of election fraud, that the vice president should reject or send to the states Biden's legitimate electoral votes rather than count them. The defendant deliberately excluded his White House counsel from the meeting because the White House counsel previously had pushed back on the defendant's false claims of election fraud. Yeah, there's a certain level to which like even attorneys have to be like, what you're doing is illegal. Maybe don't do that. I don't know exactly where that line is, but like, yeah, you can't just like say crimes in front of a lawyer to be like, well, I guess that's confidential. You can't talk about it, and they won't say anything either. I'm pretty sure there's a line where even attorneys are like, yeah, so I gotta report when you try to do illegal stuff, which is what he was trying to do. During the meeting, as reflected in the vice president's contemporaneous notes, the defendant made knowingly false claims of election fraud, including, bottom line, won every state by hundreds of thousands of votes. The insanity. And we won every state. And asked regarding a claim his senior Justice Department officials had previously told him were false, including as recently as the night before, what about 205,000 more votes in PA than voters? The defendant and co-conspirator 2 then asked the vice president to either unilaterally reject legitimate electors from the 7 targeted states, or send the question of which slate was legitimate to the targeted states' legislatures. The profusion, is that the word? The immense amount of use of both the word state and slate is throwing me off, as I'm sure you've noticed. When the vice president challenged co-conspirator 2 on whether the proposal to return the question to the states was defensible, co-conspirator 2 responded, well, nobody's tested it before. The vice president then told, this is, by the way, a Republican tactic that's been in use for a little, I don't know how long, but this isn't the first time they've done that. When at the end of Obama's administration, there was a Supreme Court seat opening. The Republicans were like, well, the Constitution doesn't say that we have to hold a hearing to reject your Supreme Court nomination. We can just not do that. This is the same thing. It's like, well, nobody's tried doing this before, and nobody thought to make it illegal because who would do this? Yeah. It's not the first time. The vice president then told the defendant, did you hear that? Even your own counsel is not saying I have that authority. The defendant responded, that's okay. I prefer the other suggestion of the vice president rejecting the electors unilaterally. On January 4th, when co-conspirator 2 acknowledged to the defendant's senior advisor that no court would support his proposal, the senior advisor told co-conspirator 2, "You're going to cause riots in the streets." Co-conspirator 2 responded that there had previously been in the nation's history where violence was necessary to protect the republic. Oof. After that conversation, the senior advisor notified the defendant that co-conspirator 2 had conceded that his plan was not going to work. On the morning of January 5th, at the defendant's discretion, the vice president's chief of staff and the vice president's counsel met again with co-conspirator 2. Co-conspirator 2 now advocated that the vice president do what the defendant had said he preferred the day before, unilaterally reject electors from the targeted states. During this meeting, co-conspirator 2 privately acknowledged to the vice president's counsel that he hoped to prevent judicial review of his proposal because he understood that it would be unanimously rejected by the Supreme Court. The Vice President's counsel expressed to co-conspirator 2 that following through with the proposal would result in a disastrous situation where the election might have to be decided in the streets. The same day, the defendant. So they also, by the way, note they have riots and insurrections and violence on their mind. This is not something they just didn't consider. I think I can't prove it, but I personally, it seems pretty clear that to me that it was planned. What happened on January 6th. They intended for that outcome. I think. I think they were hoping for more. That same day, the defendant encouraged supporters to travel to Washington on January 6th and set the false expectation that the vice president had the authority to and might use a ceremonial role at the certification proceeding to reverse the election outcome in the defendant's favor, including issuing the following tweets. Remember, he has legal confirmation that the vice president cannot do this. And he's telling his supporters that he can and to expect it. And is telling them to go to an event where he knows he's going to be riling them up. What did he think would happen? I think he thought January 6th would happen. I think he expected this. At 11:06 a.m., the vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors. This was within 40 minutes of the defendant's earlier reminder saying, "See you in D.C." At 5:05 p.m., Washington is being inundated with people who don't want to see an election victory stolen. "Our country has had enough. They won't take it anymore. We hear you and love you," from the Oval Office. At 5:43 p.m., "I will be speaking at the Save America rally tomorrow on the Ellipse at 11 a.m. Eastern. Arrive early. Doors open at 7 a.m. Eastern. Big crowds." Also on January 5th, the defendant met alone with the vice president. When the vice president refused to agree to the defendant's request that he obstruct the certification, the defendant grew frustrated and told the vice president that the defendant would have to publicly criticize him. Upon learning of this, the vice president's chief of staff was concerned for the vice president's safety and alerted the head of the vice president's Secret Service detail. Prescient. As crowds began to gather in Washington and were audible from the Oval Office, the defendant remarked to his advisors that the crowd the following day on January 6th was going to be angry. That night, the defendant approved and caused the defendant's campaign to issue a public statement that the defendant knew from his meeting with the vice president only hours earlier was false. That night, I just didn't. Got lost in that sentence. Let me reread that. That night, the defendant approved and caused the defendant's campaign to issue a public statement that the defendant knew from his meeting with the vice president only hours earlier was false. Okay. So they approved this, and they knew it was false based on the meeting they had with Pence. Okay, got it. "The vice president and I are in total agreement that the vice president has the power to act." Whew, okay. Clearly trying to indicate to his followers, Pence can do this, he knows he can do this, and isn't that interesting, and then, all the rhetoric about having the election being stolen, which it wasn't, and so on and so forth. On January 6th, starting early in the early morning hours, the defendant again turned to knowingly false statements aimed at pressuring the vice president to fraudulently alter the election outcome, and raised publicly the false expectation that the president might do so. And notice, of course, that all the pressure is on Pence here, just because he's the last thing Trump can try to overturn the election. So it's all getting pointed at him. Now he doesn't have the ability to do that, and even if he did, it doesn't mean he would necessarily do it. Um, and he definitely shouldn't. But that's why all this pressure is getting pointed in this one place. At 1 a.m., the defendant issued a tweet that falsely claimed, "If Vice President Mike Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency. Many states want to decertify the mistake they made in certifying incorrect and even fraudulent numbers in a process not approved by the legislatures, which it must be. Mike can send it back." Every part of that is not true, to be clear, as we've already covered. At 8:17 a.m., the defendant issued a tweet that falsely stated, "States want to correct their votes, which they now know were based on irregularities and fraud, plus corrupt process never received legitimate approval or legislative approval. All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states, and we win. Do it, Mike. This is time for an extreme. This is a time for extreme courage." On the morning of January 6th, an agent of the defendant contacted a United States senator to ask him to hand-deliver documents to the vice president. The agent then facilitated the receipt by the senator's staff of the fraudulent certificates signed by the defendant's fraudulent electors in Michigan and Wisconsin, which were believed to have been delivered to the vice president or archivist by mail. When one of the senator's staffers contacted a staffer for the vice president by text message to arrange for delivery of what the senator staffer had been told were alternative slates of electors for Michigan and Wisconsin, because archivists didn't receive them, the vice president's staffer rejected them. At 11:15 a.m., the defendant called the vice president again and again pressured him to fraudulently reject or return Biden's legitimate electoral votes. The vice president again refused. Immediately after the call, the defendant decided to single out the vice president in public remarks he would make within the hour, reinserting language that had been personally drafted earlier that morning, falsely claiming that the vice president had the authority to send the electoral votes to the states, but that advisor had previously successfully advocated be removed. As a note about this has been, you can go look this up, this has been discussed elsewhere, that the speech Trump had after after every instance where he would talk to Biden or talk to Pence was even more implicating of Pence, and like even more and more harsh towards him, and it just added to the how much he spoke against what Pence was doing, which was, by the way, following the law. Yeah, like it just kept getting the speech just kept getting more and more anti-Pence the more Pence refused to do the illegal, and what he didn't even have the power to do anyway. Earlier that morning, the defendant had selected co-conspirator 2 to join co-conspirator 1 in giving public remarks before his own. When they did so, based on knowingly false election fraud claims, co-conspirator 1 and co-conspirator 2 intensified pressure on the vice president to fraudulently obstruct the certification proceeding. Co-conspirator 1 told the crowd that the vice president could cast the ECA aside and unilaterally decide on the validity of these crooked ballots. He also lied when he claimed to have letters from 5 legislatures begging us to send elector slates to the legislatures for review, and called for a trial by combat. Co-conspirator 2 told the crowd, "All we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the states look into this so that we get to the bottom line of it, and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not. We no longer live in a self-governing republic if we can't get to the answer to this question." By the way, even if he had been successful in sending these slates of electors back to the states, do they think that they would just be like, well, we just don't count those and you win without them? Probably not. Do you think they wouldn't be recertified? They probably would be. But of course, he just wanted more time to put pressure on more aspects. He could again make those challenges that were fraudulent in the first place and knowingly false, as this indictment says. He can once again try to put pressure on Congress to just certify or to just announce the results of the election minus those states. He can put more pressure in these more places. That was the goal. We're almost done. 38 of 45. Next, beginning at 11:56 a.m., the defendant made multiple knowingly false statements integral to his criminal plans to defeat the federal government function, obstruct the certification, and interfere with others' right to vote and have their votes counted. The defendant repeated false claims of election fraud, gave false hope that the vice president might change the election outcome, and directed the crowd in front of him to go to the Capitol as a means to obstruct the certification and pressure the vice president to fraudulently obstruct the certification. The defendant's knowingly false statements for these purposes included. So yeah, as I've been pointing out before, he's stoking up his followers with false claims, getting them all angry about it, and then point them at the Capitol. What else was going to happen? The defendant falsely claimed that, based on fraud, the vice president could alter the outcome of the election results, stating, "I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope so. Because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election. All he has to do, this is from the number one, or certainly one of the top constitutional lawyers in our country. He has the absolute right to do it. We are supposed to protect our country, support our Constitution, and protect our Constitution. States want to revote. The state got defrauded. Now they were given false information. They voted on it. Now they want to recertify. They want it back. All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to certify and to recertify, and we become president, and you are the happiest people." I hope at this point I don't have to make clear how every part of this is not true. The indictment has been pretty thorough to this point of explaining that. After the defendant falsely stated that the Pennsylvania legislature wanted to recertify their votes, they want to recertify, but the only way that can happen is if Mike Pence agrees to send it back. The crowd began to chant, "Send it back." The defendant also said that the regular rules no longer applied, stating, "And fraud breaks up everything, doesn't it? When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules." So, no, you're not. But also, there are rules for fraud. You followed them up until the point where it was clear that there wasn't fraud. And then you began doing this criminal shit. Finally, after exhorting that we fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore, the defendant directed the people in front of him to head to the Capitol, suggested he was going with them, and told them to give the members of Congress the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back the country. Literally, you have to fight? Hey, go that way. But I don't know why there are no charges of inciting an insurrection. I don't know. I just don't know. During and after the defendant's remarks, thousands of people marched towards the Capitol. Well, they did a little bit more than march. So that's the end, I think, of the Pence section. So now we're on to the defendant's exploitation of the violence and chaos at the Capitol. Shortly before 1 p.m., the vice president issued a public statement explaining that his role as the president of the Senate and at the certification proceeding that. Let me start this over. Some of these sentences are complicated enough, and I'm like weary from reading so much that I'll just trip over it. Bear with me, please. We're nearly done. Shortly before 1 p.m., the vice president issued a public statement explaining that his role as president of the Senate at the certification proceeding that was about to begin did not include unilateral authority to determine which electoral votes should be counted and which should not. Before the defendant had finished speaking, a crowd began to gather at the Capitol. Thereafter, a mass of people, including individuals who had traveled to Washington and to the Capitol at the defendant's direction, broke through barriers, cordoning off the Capitol grounds and advanced on the building, including by violently attacking law enforcement officers trying to secure it. The defendant, who had returned to the White House after concluding his remarks, watched the events at the Capitol unfold on the television in his dining room next to the Oval Office. Upon receiving news that individuals had breached the Capitol, the defendant's advisors told him that there was a riot there and that the rioters had breached the building. When advisors urged the defendant to issue a calming message aimed at the rioters, the defendant refused, instead repeatedly remarking that the people at the Capitol were angry because the election had been stolen. At 2:24 p.m., after advisors had left the defendant Alone in his dining room, the defendant issued a tweet intended to further delay and obstruct the certification. Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a correct set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth. Notice, refusal to calm them down, but more than happy to stoke them into additional fervor. I think he wanted what happened. He wanted more than what happened. He wanted them to be successful. 1 minute later, at 2:25 p.m., the United States Secret Service was forced to evacuate the vice president to a secure location. At the Capitol, throughout the afternoon, members of the crowd chanted, "Hang Mike Pence, where is Pence, bring him out, and Traitor Pence." The defendant repeatedly refused to approve a message directing rioters to leave the Capitol, as urged by his most senior advisors, including the White House counsel, a deputy White House counsel, the chief of staff, a deputy chief of staff, and a senior advisor. Instead, the defendant issued 2 tweets that did not ask rioters to leave the Capitol, but instead falsely suggested that the crowd at the Capitol was being peaceful, including, at 2:38 p.m., "Please support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They are truly on the side of our country. Stay peaceful." At 3:13 p.m., "I am asking for everyone at the United States Capitol to remain peaceful. No violence. Remember, we are the party of law and order, and respect the law and our great men and women in blue. Thank you." So this is what Republicans and, well, authoritarians and fascists, this is what they mean by law and order. My will is the law he's referring to. Staying peaceful. So this is a little bit of like, I guess a little bit of theory. The state in like political philosophy is the organization that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. This is why you'll see articles that say violence erupted after police beat a protester or whatever. Well, it's like, no. It erupted when they beat the protester, then there was additional violence, right? But the thought there, the understanding, the people you just have kind of implicitly, they don't really realize it's there, is that the state is allowed to do legitimate violence. They have a mechanism by which their violence can be legitimate. So when he's saying remain peaceful, no violence, I wonder how much of that is like, well, yeah, your violence is legitimate, so it's not violence. I don't know. It's probably too high thinking for someone of his intellectual caliber, but it's something that comes to my mind at the very least. And I know for people who know about this that was a, highly reductive synopsis of what that theory is. In any case, back to the indictment. We're almost done. Almost done. At 3 p.m., the defendant had a phone call with the minority leader of the United States House of Representatives. The defendant told the minority leader that the crowd at the Capitol was more upset about the election than the minority leader was. At 4:17 p.m., the defendant released a video message on Twitter that he had just taped in the White House Rose Garden. In it, the defendant repeated the knowingly false claim that we had an election that was stolen from us, and finally asked individuals to leave the Capitol while telling them that they were very special and that we love you. So notice again, he's like reiterating the election being stolen line. There's a part of me that thinks he was like made to record this, didn't want to, and was hoping that if he was sufficiently weak in his asking them to leave, that they just wouldn't, but he can, have that plausible have done it. Well, I said to leave, as he's reminding them of why they're there, why they're angry, and then telling them that they're special and he loves them. I don't know. I think when he was recording this, this is at most for the purposes of plausible deniability. I don't think he wanted them to leave. After the 4:17 p.m. tweet, as the defendant joined others in the outer Oval Office to watch the attack on the Capitol on television, the defendant said, "See, this is what happens when they try to steal an election. These people are angry. These people are really angry about it. This is what happens." I do really think that, given what he said, it feels to me like Trump believes the election was stolen, even though he knows that like his claims were not true. Like, he's acknowledged his claims weren't true, but like still stolen because like I said, he's massively insecure. He cannot come to grips with the concept that he lost, that people don't like him more, that he in this case is the loser, as he would say. He likes to call everyone who doesn't succeed at a thing like, you're a loser, I'm a winner. No, you're the loser, dude. At 6:01 p.m., the defendant tweeted, "These are the things that and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever." I agree. We should remember this day forever, but not for the reasons he thinks. On the evening of January 6th, the defendant and co-conspirator 1 attempted to exploit the violence and chaos at the Capitol by calling lawmakers to convince them, based on knowingly false claims of election fraud, to delay the certification, including the defendant, through White House aides, attempted to reach 2 United States senators at 6 p.m. From 6:59 p.m. until 7:18 p.m., co-conspirator 1 placed calls to 5 United States senators and 1 United States representative. Co-conspirator 6 attempted to confirm phone numbers for 6 United States senators whom the defendant had directed co-conspirator 1 to call and attempted to enlist in further delaying the certification. In one of those calls, co-conspirator 1 left a voicemail intended for a United States senator that said, "We need you, our Republican friends, to try to just slow it down so we can get those legislatures to get more information to you. And I know they're reconvening at 8 tonight, but the only strategy we can follow is to object to numerous states and raise issues so that we get ourselves into tomorrow, ideally until the end of tomorrow." So I wonder how much of the I mean, it doesn't say who they called, but I wonder if that's why like people like Marjorie Taylor Greene were still claiming objections after they reconvened, after being shepherded out because they were being attacked and their lives were in danger. In another message intended for another United States senator, co-conspirator 1 repeated knowingly false allegations of election fraud, including that the vote counts certified by the states to Congress were incorrect, and that the governors who had certified knew they were incorrect, that illegal immigrants had voted in substantial numbers in Arizona, and that Georgia gave you a number which is 65,000 people who were underage voted. Completely new, like completely manufactured. Like why this hasn't come up before, but if that were true, that seems like it'd be relevant. Co-conspirator 1 also claimed that the vice president's actions had been surprising and asked the senator to object to every state and kind of spread this out a little bit like a filibuster. Now, again, trying to impede the proceedings even after the failed insurrection. At 7:01 p.m., while co-conspirator 1 was calling United States senators on behalf of the defendant, the White House counsel called the defendant to ask him to withdraw any objections and allow the certification. The defendant refused. The attack on the Capitol obstructed and delayed certification for approximately 6 hours until the Senate and House of Representatives came back into session separately at 8:06 p.m. and 9:02 p.m. respectively, and came together in a joint session at 11:35 p.m. At 11:44 p.m., co-conspirator 2 emailed the Vice President's counsel advocating that the Vice President violate the law and seek further delay of the certification. Co-conspirator 2 wrote, "I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation of the ECA and adjourn for 10 days to allow the legislatures to finish their investigations, as well as to allow a full forensic audit of the massive amount of illegal activity that has occurred here." As of 3:41 a.m. on January 7th, the President of the Senate, the Vice President, as President of the Senate, the Vice President announced the certified results of the 2020 presidential election in favor of Biden. The defendant and his co-conspirators committed one or more of the acts to affect the object of the conspiracy alleged above in paragraphs. Okay, I'm not going to read out all the paragraphs. In violation of that section of the code. So that was count 1, which I don't even remember at this point. Count 1, conspiracy to defraud the United States. All right, so now we're on count 2, which is like down here. Count 2, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. The allegations contained in paragraphs 1 through 4 and 8 through 123 of this indictment are realleged and fully incorporated here by reference. From on or about November 14th, 2020 through on or about January 7th, 2021 in the District of Columbia and elsewhere, the defendant Donald J. Trump did knowingly combine, conspire, confederate, and agree with co-conspirators known and unknown to the grand jury to corruptly obstruct and impede an official proceeding, that is the certification of the electoral vote, in violation of the Penal Code. Count 3, obstruction of and attempt to obstruct an official proceeding. The allegations contain, okay, from on or about November 14th, 2020 through on or about January 7th, 2021 in the District of Columbia and elsewhere, the defendant Donald J. Trump attempted to and did corruptly obstruct and impede an official proceeding, that is certification of the electoral vote. Count 4, conspiracy against rights. The allegations contained in paragraphs 1 through 4 in paragraphs 1 through 4 and 8 through 123 of this indictment are here fully re-alleged. From on or about November 14th, 2020 through on or about January 20th, 2021 in the District of Columbia and elsewhere, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, did knowingly combine, conspire, confederate, and agree with co-conspirators known to and unknown to the grand jury to injure, oppress, threaten, and intimidate one or more persons in the free exercise and enjoyment of a right and privilege secured to them by the Constitution and laws of the United States, that is the right to vote and have one's vote counted. Signed by Jack Smith. Something that's noteworthy to me is that conspiracy against rights is a federal crime. It makes me wonder about those like Texas laws that were like, oh, you can sue someone for taking someone to get an abortion, which is their right. Obviously, it doesn't matter now with Roe v. Wade overturned, and it doesn't matter to this, but it made me think about it. So there we have it. The indictment against Trump. It took kind of a while, not as long as I thought, but we got through it, and now we understand why he is being indicted. Note once more, he is not being charged or indicted based on telling lies, about lying about the election, about claiming the election fraud. The indictment is very clear at the top, if you remember, that this is completely legal. It's not a good thing to do. It's pretty bad, actually, but it's legal. What is illegal were all the actions laid out here that Trump and his co-conspirators allegedly engaged in. My guess is it's pretty clear that they did, that are completely illegal, that sought to overturn the election despite their claims that they were doing the opposite. We'll see how this goes. I know there's more news about it, including Trump more or less threat. You know what? Let's actually get into it. Let's not. What was it? It's like Trump tweet about like. We'll see if we can find it. No, it's not payback. It's Okay, here we go. So recently, there's been some discussion about like the court proceedings for this case. That unlike in the Espionage Act case, this judge is not a Trump appointee and sycophant. Instead, it is an Obama appointee who is having none of his bullshit. And, Trump on Friday tweeted the following: "If you go after me, I'm coming after you." A pretty clear, well, I guess not tweet, it's on Truth Social, Truth. Pretty clearly a threat, right? Like, oh, you're coming after me with legal action, I'll come after you. Pretty clearly a threat. And so, if I'm not mistaken, Jack Smith was like, hey, can we get like an injunction against him like literally threatening people, because this is, it's intimidating both witnesses and jurors and whatever. And they pushed to like delay that, but I think it's today that Trump had to go to court and like justify this tweet or this injunction. So we'll have more news about that. If I find something about it, I'll let you all in on it tomorrow. I am quite weary from reading that, but just like note, there are more developments going, and I'm curious to see where this goes or how quickly they can get this resolved. It seems pretty clear that these are very serious, and that a lot of the objections that we went over last week are nonsense. Things like, oh, why is it 2.5 years later? Well, because it takes a while to investigate, especially when it comes to a conspiracy. But I hope it's clear to everyone what the allegations are, what they're not, and how substantiated they are. Obviously, this isn't like here's how. There's no information here like here's how we know that this happened. But I'm pretty confident that it wouldn't be in here if it wasn't something that could be demonstrated and proved. And we'll see how these things go. Uh, just a reminder, as we see all of this, fascism's bad and authoritarianism's bad. We should fight those things, like like when they were happening here, but not just like when they were happening here. Just in general, this is kind of bad. This is what happens when you empower authoritarians. You start to lose things like your right to vote. If this election had been overturned successfully by the Trump campaign, there's a pretty real chance that voting would not be a thing in this country anymore, or at the very least, not meaningfully. I mean, there's voting in Syria. Is it Syria or wherever? I think Assad is in Syria, where it's like he always gets like 99% of the vote. No, there's not. It's not really. Yeah, there's not really voting. Even like Hitler had elections where it's like, all right, do you want to vote for like Hitler or the other guy? And like a Gestapo guy is behind you with a gun or whatever. Like, yeah, you wouldn't meaningfully have elections if they can be so easily overturned. And so that's why this is all important. But yeah, I'm glad we went over it. It was rather grueling, so I'm a bit tired, and I am about ready to sign off. So thank you all so much for watching. We'll be back with more stimulating, thrilling content. No, I really do hope you found this valuable. I did. It's a lot to go through, but now it's clear to understand. Like if people start, I'm sure Trump supporters gonna be like, they're getting mad because he spoke. It's freedom of speech. No, 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 no. It's not what he said. It's what he did, and the fact that what he did was a criminal attempt to overturn an election. That's what he did. So I'm glad we went over it. Thanks everyone so much for watching. Don't forget, get more people watching if you find this interesting. If you want more conversations with people like Calvin from last week, tell your friends. Get this follower number up. Just as a reminder, if we get partnered on Kick, I'll make myself a cup of tea with salt or pepper instead of sugar, and I'll just subject myself to pain for your amusement. And isn't that, at the end of the day, what the internet's all about? But that said, thank you everyone so much for watching, and we'll be back tomorrow. I'll catch you next time, and have a great rest of your day. Bye!